Chapter 1. From a Day of Delight to Death. April 14, 1912. A fateful date. Lulled to false security. Peaceful Sabbath ends in dire disaster. Hopes sink beneath the cruel and treacherous waves of the Atlantic. Man's proudest craft crumbles like an eggshell. The hands of the ship's clock pointed to 11:40. The beautiful day of April 14, 1912, rapidly was drawing to its close. A solemn hush brooded over the ocean, the stillness broken only by the swish of the waters as they protested against being so rudely brushed aside by the mammoth creation of man. Then, too, the soft cadences of sacred music from the ship's orchestra sent their strains dancing o'er the billows to mingle with the star beam and intensify rather than mar the stillness. Above, the stars and planets twinkled and glittered as they beam only in the rarefied atmosphere of the far northern latitudes. The day had been one of rare beauty. A soft and caressing breeze had kissed the sea and rocked the waves in a harmonious symphony against the steel-ribbed sides of the world's largest, greatest, and most luxurious floating palace, the majestic Titanic, the newest addition to the transatlantic fleet of the White Star Line of the International Navigation Company. The star-sprinkled dome of heaven and the phosphorescent sea alike breathed forth peace, quiet, and security. Despite the lateness of the hour, aboard the Titanic all was animation. A few, to be sure, had wearied of nature's marvels and had sought their slumber, but the gorgeous quarters of the first cabin and the scarcely less pretentious sections set apart for second-class passengers were alike teeming with life and light. Meanwhile, as they had for days past, the mighty engines of this monster of the sea pulsed and throbbed, while the rhythmic beat of the Titanic's great bronze-bladed propellers churned up a fast and steadily lengthening wake behind the speeded vessel. "We'll break the record today," her officers laughed, and the passengers gleefully shared their mirth. A record, and the record she made, but of death and destruction. But who could know? And since no mortal could, why not eat, drink, and be merry? Britain's shores had been left behind, far back across the waste of waters. America, the land of hope, was almost in sight ahead. Talk of home and friends and life. Small wonder that hundreds still strolled the Titanic's spotless, unsullied decks and talked of home and friends and life and joy and hope. Small wonder that other hundreds lounged at ease in her luxurious saloons and smoking rooms, while other scores of voyagers, their appetites whetted by the invigorating air, sat at a midnight supper to welcome the new week with a feast. Why sleep when the wealth, the beauty, the brains, the aristocracy, as well as the bone and sinew of a nation, were all around one. For, be it known, never before did ship carry so distinguished a company, a passenger list that reads like a social blue book. This maiden trip of the Titanic was an event that was to go down in history, they thought. And so it will, but with tears on every page of the narrative, and the wails of women and children in every syllable. But since the future is unrolled only in God's own good time, how could they know? Why wonder at their presence? Was this not the first trip of the greatest triumph of marine architecture? Had not the wealth and fashion of two continents so arranged their plans as to be numbered on its first passenger list? Had not the hardy immigrant skimped and saved and schemed that he and his family should be carried to the land of promise aboard this greatest of all ships? What mattered it to him that his place was in the steerage? Did not each pulsing throb of the Titanic's mighty engines bear him as far and as fast as though he too already held in his hand the millions he felt he was destined to win in this golden land of opportunity beyond the seas? And so, from the loftiest promenade deck to the lowest stoke hole in the vitals of the ship, peace and comfort and happiness reigned. Approaching home and friends. To some, the rapidly nearing shores of America meant home and friends. To others, opportunity and work. Yet to all it meant the culmination of a voyage which so far had been one all too short holiday from the bustle and turmoil of a busy world. Man proposes, but God disposes. Never were truer words uttered, nor phrase more fitting to that fateful hour. In the midst of life we are in death. Yet the soft breeze from the south still spread its balmy, salt-laden odors to delight their senses and to lull them to a feeling of complete security. What was that? A cold breath, as from the fastnesses of the Frost King, swept the steamer's decks. A shiver of chill drove the wearied passengers below, but sent the ship's officers scurrying to their stations. The seamen, and the seamen alone, knew that that icy chill portended icebergs, and near at hand. Besides, twice in the last few hours had the wireless ticked its warnings from passing vessels that the Titanic was in the vicinity of immense floes. Why had the warning not been heeded? Why had the ponderous engines continued to thunder with the might of 100,000 horses, and the ship to plunge forward into the night with the unchecked speed of an express train? God knows. The captain knew, but his lips are sealed in death, as, a self-inflicted bullet in his brain, he lies in the cold embrace of the sea he had loved and had defied too long. The lookout's warning cry. Perhaps Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the line, who was on board and survived when women drowned, also knows. Perhaps he will tell by whose orders those danger warnings were scoffed at and ignored. Perhaps. The lookout uttered a sharp cry. Too late. One grinding crash, and the Titanic had received its death blow. Man's proudest craft crumbled like an eggshell. Ripped from stem to engine room by the great mass of ice, she struck amidships. The Titanic's side was laid open as if by a gigantic can-opener. She quickly listed to starboard, and a shower of ice fell onto the forecastle deck. Shortly before she sank, she broke in two abaft the engine room, and as she disappeared beneath the water, the expulsion of air or her boilers caused two explosions, which were plainly heard by the survivors adrift. A moment more, and the Titanic had gone to her doom, with the fated hundreds grouped on the afterdeck. To the survivors they were visible to the last, and their cries and moans were pitiable. The one alleviating circumstance in the otherwise unmitigable tragedy is the fact that the men stood aside and insisted that the women and the children should first have places in the boats. There were men whose word of command swayed boards of directors, governed institutions, disposed of millions. They were accustomed merely to pronounce a wish to have it gratified. Thousands posted at their bidding. The complexion of the market altered hue when they nodded. They bought what they wanted, and for one of the humblest fishing smacks or a dory, they could have given the price that was paid to build and launch the ship that has become the most imposing mausoleum that ever housed the bones of men since the pyramids rose from the desert sands. But these men stood aside, one can see them, and gave place not merely to the delicate and the refined, but to the scared Czech woman from the steerage with her baby at her breast, the Croatian with a toddler by her side, coming through the very gate of death and out of the mouth of hell to the imagined Eden of America. Harder to go than to stay. To many of those who went, it was harder to go than to stay there on the vessel, gaping with its mortal wounds and ready to go down. It meant that tossing on the waters they must wait in suspense, hour after hour, even after the lights of the ship were engulfed in appalling darkness, hoping against hope for the miracle of a rescue dearer to them than their own lives. It was the tradition of Anglo-Saxon heroism that was fulfilled in the frozen seas during the black hours of that Sunday night. The heroism was that of the women who went, as well as of the men who remained. The most adequate story of the terrible disaster is told by a trained newspaper man who was on the Carpathia. He says, "Cause, responsibility, and similar questions regarding the stupendous disaster will be taken up in time by the British marine authorities. No disposition has been shown by any survivor to question the courage of the crew, hundreds of whom saved others and gave their own lives with a heroism which equaled, but could not exceed, that of John Jacob Astor, Henry B. Harris, Jacques Futrelle, and others in the long list of the first cabin missing. Facts which I have established by inquiries on the Carpathia, as positively as they could be established, in view of the silence of the few surviving officers, are that the Titanic's officers knew, several hours before the crash, of the possible nearness of icebergs; that the Titanic's speed, nearly 23 knots an hour, was not slackened. Insufficient lifeboats. That the number of lifeboats on the Titanic was insufficient to accommodate much more than 1/3 of the passengers, to say nothing of the crew. Most members of the crew say there were 16 lifeboats and 2 collapsibles. None say there were more than 20 boats in all. The 700 who escaped filled most of the 16 lifeboats, and the 1 collapsible which got away, to the limit of their capacity. That the "women first" rule in some cases was applied to the extent of turning back men who were with their families, even though not enough women to fill the boats were at hand on that particular part of the deck. Some few boats were thus lowered without being completely filled, but most of these were soon filled with sailors and stewards, picked up out of the water, who helped man them. That the bulkhead system, though probably working in the manner intended, availed only to delay the ship's sinking. The position and length of the ship's wound on the starboard quarter admitted icy water, which caused the boilers to explode, and these explosions practically broke the ship in two. Had the ship struck the iceberg head on, at whatever speed, and with whatever resultant shock, the bulkhead system of watertight compartments would probably have saved the vessel. As one man expressed it, it was the impossible that happened when, with a shock unbelievably mild, the ship's side was torn for a length which made the bulkhead system ineffective. The Titanic was 1,799 miles from Queenstown, and 1,191 miles from New York, speeding for a maiden voyage record. The night was starlight, the sea glassy. Lights were out in most of the staterooms, and only 2 or 3 congenial groups remained in the public rooms. In the crow's nest, or lookout, and on the bridge, officers and members of the crew were at their places, awaiting relief at midnight from their 2 hours' watch. At 11:45 came the sudden sound of 2 gongs, a warning of immediate danger. The crash against the iceberg, which had been sighted at only a quarter of a mile, came almost simultaneously with the clink of the levers operated by those on the bridge, which stopped the engine and closed the watertight doors. Captain Smith on the bridge. Captain Smith was on the bridge a moment later, giving orders for the summoning of all on board, and for the putting on of life preservers and the lowering of the lifeboats. The first boats lowered contained more men passengers than the latter ones, as the men were on deck first, and not enough women were there to fill them. When, a moment later, the rush of frightened women and crying children to the deck began, enforcement of the women first rule became rigid. Officers loading some of the boats drew revolvers, but in most cases the men, both passengers and crew, behaved in a way that called for no such restraint. Revolver shots, heard by many persons shortly before the end of the Titanic, caused many rumors. One was that Captain Smith shot himself. Another was that First Officer Murdoch ended his life. Smith, Murdoch, and Sixth Officer Moody are known to have been lost. The surviving officers, Lightoller, Pittman, Boxhall, and Lowe, have made no statement. Members of the crew discredit all reports of suicide, and say Captain Smith remained on the bridge until just before the ship sank, leaping only after those on the decks had been washed away. It is also related that when a cook later sought to pull him aboard a lifeboat, he exclaimed, "Let me go," and jerking away, went down. What became of the men with life preservers is a question asked since the disaster by many persons. The preservers did their work of supporting their wearers in the water until the ship went down. Many of those drawn into the vortex, despite the preservers, did not come up again. Dead bodies floated on the surface as the last boats moved away. Nearer, my God, to Thee. To relate that the ship's string band gathered in the saloon near the end and played "Nearer, my God, to Thee" sounds like an attempt to give an added solemn color to a scene which was in itself the climax of solemnity. But various passengers and survivors of the crew agree in the declaration that they heard this music. To some of the hearers, with husbands among the dying men in the water, and at the ship's rail, the strain brought in thought the words, "So by my woes I'll be nearer, my God, to Thee, nearer to Thee." Women and children first was the order in the filling of the Titanic's lifeboats. How well that order was fulfilled, the list of missing first and second cabin passengers bears eloquent witness. Mr. is before almost every name, and the contrast is but made stronger by the presence of a few names of women. Mrs. Isidore Strauss, who chose death rather than to leave her husband's side. Mrs. Allison, who remained below with her husband and daughter. And others, who in various ways were kept from entering the line of those to be saved. To most of the passengers, the midnight crash against the ice mountain did not seem of terrific force. Many were so little disturbed by it that they hesitated to dress and put on life preservers, even when summoned by that thundering knocks and shouts of the stewards. Bridge players in the smoking room kept on with their game. Once on deck, many hesitated to enter the swinging lifeboats. The glassy sea, the starlit sky, the absence, in the first few moments, of intense excitement, gave them the feeling that there was only some slight mishap, that those who got into the boats would have a chilly half-hour below, and might later be laughed at. It was such a feeling as this, from all accounts, which caused John Jacob Astor and his wife to refuse the places offered them in the first boat, and to retire to the gymnasium. In the same way, H. J. Allison, Montreal banker, laughed at the warning, and his wife, reassured by him, took her time about dressing. They and their daughter did not reach the Carpathia. Their son, less than 2 years old, was carried into a lifeboat by his nurse, and was taken in charge by Major Arthur Pochin. Admiration and confidence. The admiration felt by passengers and crew for the matchlessly appointed vessel was translated, in those first few moments, into a confidence which for some proved deadly. In the loading of the first boat restrictions of sex were not made, and it seemed to the men who piled in beside the women that there would be boats enough for all. But the ship's officers knew better than this, and as the spreading fear caused an earnest advance toward the suspended craft, the order, "Women first," was heard, and the men were pushed aside. To the scenes of the next 2 hours on those decks, and in the waters below, such adjectives as dramatic and tragic do but poor justice. With the knowledge of deadly peril gaining greater power each moment over those men and women, the nobility of the greater part, both among cabin passengers, officers, crew, and steerage, asserted itself. Isidor Strauss, supporting his wife on her way to a lifeboat, was held back by an inexorable guard. Another officer strove to help her to a seat of safety, but she brushed away his arm and clung to her husband, crying, "I will not go without you." Another woman took her place, and her form, clinging to her husband's, became part of a picture now drawn indelibly in many minds. Neither wife nor husband reached a place of safety. Colonel Astor, holding his young wife's arm, stood decorously aside as the officer spoke to him, and Mrs. Astor and her maid were ushered to seats. Mrs. Henry B. Harris, parted in like manner from her husband, saw him last at the rail beside Colonel Astor. Walter M. Clark, of Los Angeles, nephew of the Montana senator, joined the line of men as his young wife, sobbing, was placed in one of the boats. An agonizing separation. "Let him come! There is room!" cried Mrs. Emil Tausig as the men of the White Star Line motioned to her husband to leave her. It was with difficulty that he released her hold to permit her to be led to her place. George D. Widener, who had been in Captain Smith's company a few moments after the crash, was another whose wife was parted from him and lowered a moment later to the surface of the calm sea. Of Major Archie Butt, a favorite with his fellow tourists. Of Charles M. Hayes, president of the Grand Trunk. Of Benjamin Guggenheim and of William T. Stead, no one seems to know whether they tarried too long in their staterooms, or whether they forbore to approach the fast-filling boats. None of them was in the throng which, weary hours afterward, reached the Carpathia. Simultaneously, on all the upper decks of the ship, the ropes creaked with the lowering of the boats. As they reached the water, those in the boats saw what those on the decks could not see: that the Titanic was listing rapidly to starboard, and that her stern was rising at a portentous angle. A rush of steerage men toward the boats was checked by officers with revolvers in hand. Some of the boats, crowded too full to give rowers a chance, drifted for a time. None had provisions or water. There was lack of covering from the icy air, and the only lights were the still undimmed arcs and incandescence of the settling ship, save for one of the first boats. There, a steward, who explained to the passengers that he had been shipwrecked twice before, appeared, carrying 3 oranges and a green light. That green light, many of the survivors say, was to the shipwrecked hundreds as the pillar of fire by night. Long after the ship had disappeared, and while confusing false lights danced about the boats, the green lantern kept them together on the course which led them to the Carpathia. Echoing splash of chilly waters. As the end of the Titanic became manifestly but a matter of moments, the oarsmen pulled their boats away, and the chilling waters began to echo splash after splash as the passengers and sailors and life-preservers leaped over and started swimming away to escape the expected suction. Only the hardiest of constitutions could endure for more than a few moments such a numbing bath. The first vigorous strokes gave way to the heart-breaking cries of "Help! Help!" and stiffened forms were seen floating, the faces relaxed in death. Revolver shots were heard in the ship's last moments. The first report spread among the boats was that Captain Smith had ended his life with a bullet. Then it was said that a mate had shot a steward who tried to push his way upon a boat against orders. None of these tales has been verified, and many of the crew say the captain, without a preserver, leaped in at the last and went down, refusing a cook's offered aid. The last of the boats, a collapsible, was launched too late to get away, and was overturned by the ship's sinking. Some of those in it, all, say some witnesses, found safety on a raft or were picked up by lifeboats. In the Marconi Tower, almost to the last, the loud click of the sending instrument was heard over the waters. Who was receiving the message? Those in the boats did not know, and they would least of all have supposed that a Mediterranean ship in the distant South Atlantic track would be their rescuer. As the screams in the water multiplied, another sound was heard, strong and clear at first, then fainter in the distance. It was the melody of the hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee," played by the string orchestra in the dining saloon. Some of those on the water started to sing the words, but grew silent as they realized that for the men who played, the music was a sacrament soon to be consummated by death. The serene strains of the hymn and the frantic cries of the dying blended in a symphony of sorrow. Boats follow the green light. Led by the green light, under the light of the stars, the boats drew away, and the bow, then the quarter, then the stacks, and at last the stern of the marvel ship of a few days before passed beneath the waters. The great force of the ship's sinking was unaided by any violence of the elements, and the suction, into so great as had been feared, rocked but mildly the group of boats now a quarter of a mile distant from it. 16 boats were in the forlorn procession which entered on the terrible hours of rowing, drifting, and suspense. Women wept for lost husbands and sons. Sailors sobbed for the ship which had been their pride. Men choked back tears and sought to comfort the widowed. Perhaps, they said, other boats might have put off in another direction toward the last. They strove, though none too sure themselves, to convince the women of the certainty that a rescue ship would appear. Early dawn brought no ship, but not long after 5 a.m. the Carpathia, far out of her path and making 18 knots instead of her wonted 15, showed her single red and black smokestack upon the horizon. In the joy of that moment, the heaviest griefs were forgotten. Soon afterward, Captain Rostrum and Chief Steward Hughes were welcoming the chilled and bedraggled arrivals over the Carpathia's side. Terrible as were the San Francisco, Slocum, and Iroquois disasters, they shrink to local events in comparison with this world catastrophe. True, there were others of greater qualifications and longer experience than I, nearer the tragedy, but they, by every token of likelihood, have become a part of the tragedy. The honored, must I say, lamented, Stead, the adroit Jacques Futrelle, what might they not tell were their hands able to hold pencil. The silence of the Carpathia's engines, the piercing cold, the clamor of many voices in the companionways, caused me to dress hurriedly and awaken my wife at 5:40 a.m. Monday. Our stewardess, meeting me outside, pointed to a wailing host in the rear dining room and said, "From the Titanic. She's at the bottom of the ocean." The last of the line of boats. At the ship's side, a moment later, I saw the last of the line of boats discharge their loads, and saw women, some with cheap shawls about their heads, some with the costliest of fur cloaks, ascending the ship's side, and such joy as the first sight of our ship may have given them had disappeared from their faces, and there were tears and signs of faltering as the women were helped up the ladders or hoisted aboard in swings. For lack of room to put them, several of the Titanic's boats after unloading were set adrift. At our north was a broad ice field, the length of hundreds of Carpathias. Around us on other sides were sharp and glistening peaks. One black berg, seen about 10 a.m., was said to be that which sunk the Titanic. In his tiny house over the second cabin smoking room was Harold Cotton, the Marconi operator. A ruddy English youth, whose work at his post, on what seemed ordinary duty until almost midnight, had probably saved the lives of the huddling hundreds below. Already he was knitting his brows over the problem of handling the messages which were coming in batches from the purser's office. The haste with which these marconograms were prepared by their senders was needless, in view of the wait of 2 days and 2 nights for a long connection. Safe was the word with which most of the messages began. Then, in many of them, came the words blank missing. Disheveled women, who the night before could have drawn thousands from husbands' letters of credit or from Titanic's safe, stood penniless before the Carpathia's purser, asking that their messages be forwarded collect. Their messages were taken with the rest. Hope revived by sight of cattle boat. The Californian, a cattle ship, came near us, and though it gave no sign of having any of the Titanic's refugees on board, its presence in the vicinity gave hope to many women who were encouraged in the belief that the Californian might have picked up their loved ones. Captain Rostrom's decision to abandon the Mediterranean course, begun the Thursday before, and to return to an American port, was soon known to the passengers. At first, it was reported that Halifax or Boston would be the destination, but at noon the notice of the intended arrival at New York 3 days later was posted. At that time the Carpathia, at an increase over her usual moderate speed, was westward bound, and her passengers were deferring their hopes of Gibraltar, Naples, and Trieste, and were sharing their rooms with the newcomers. Few men of the Carpathia's passenger list slept in a bed in any of the nights that followed. They had the men of the Titanic lay in chairs on deck, on dining tables or smoking room couches, or on the floors of the rooms which held their hand baggage and their curtained off guests. The captain was the first to vacate his room, which was used as a hospital. In the first cabin library, women of wealth and refinement mingled their grief, and asked eagerly for news of the possible arrival of a belated boat, or a message from some other steamer telling of the safety of their husbands. Mrs. Henry B. Harris, wife of a New York theatrical manager, checked her tears long enough to beg that some message of hope be sent to her father-in-law. Mrs. Ella Thor, Miss Marie Young, Mrs. Emil Taussig, and her daughter Ruth, Mrs. Martin Rothschild, Mrs. William Augustus Spencer, Mrs. J. Stewart White, and Mrs. Walter M. Clark were a few of those who lay back, exhausted, on the leather cushions, and told in shuddering sentences of their experiences. Proud of her husband's oarsmanship, Mrs. John Jacob Astor and the Countess of Rothes had been taken to staterooms soon after their arrival on shipboard. Those who talked with Mrs. Astor said she spoke often of her husband's ability as an oarsman, and said he could save himself if he had a chance. That he could have had such a chance she seemed hardly to hope. To another stateroom a tall, dark man had been conducted, his head bowed, anguish in his face. He was Bruce Ismay, head of the International Mercantile Marine, and chief owner of the Titanic and her sister ship, the Olympic. He has made the maiden voyage on each of his company's great ships. He remained in his room in a physician's care during the voyage back to New York. Captain Rostrum, his only caller, was not admitted to see him until Tuesday evening. Before noon, at the captain's request, the first cabin passengers of the Titanic gathered in the saloon, and the passengers of other classes in corresponding places on the rescue ship. Then the collecting of names was begun by the purser and the stewards. A second table was served in both cabins for the new guests, and the Carpathia's second cabin being better fitted than its first, the second-class arrivals had to be sent to the steerage. In the middle of the morning, the Carpathia passed near the spot, seamen said, where the Titanic went down. Only a few floating chairs marked the place. The ice peaks had changed their position. Which of those in sight, if any, caused the wreck was matter of conjecture. those of the refugees who had not lost relatives found subject for distress in the reflection that their money and jewels were at the bottom of the sea. Miss Edith L. Rosenbaum, writer for a fashion trade journal, mourned the loss of trunks containing robes from Paris and Tunis. Several of the late works of Philip Mock, miniature painter, were in his lost baggage, but the artist was not inclined to dwell on this mishap. An object of pitying sighs. The child of the Montreal Allisons, bereft of both parents and carried by a nurse, was an object of pitying sighs in the saloon. In the second cabin, 2 French children engaged pitying attention. The 2 boys, 4 and 2 years old, who had lost their mother a year before, and their father the night before, were children of beauty and intelligence, but were too abashed to answer any questions, even those put in their native tongue. Their surname is believed to be Hoffman. They are now in the care of Miss Margaret Hayes, of 304 West 83rd Street, New York. Reminiscences of 2 bridge whist games of Sunday night in the smoking room and the lounge room were exchanged by passengers who believed that the protracted games, a violation of the strict Sabbath rules of English vessels, saved their lives. Alfred Drachenstadt was leader in the smoking room game, Miss Dorothy Gibson in the other. Mrs. Jacques Futrelle, wife of the novelist, herself a writer of note, sat dry-eyed in the saloon, telling her friends that she had given up hope for her husband. She joined with the rest in inquiries as to the chances of rescue by another ship, and no one told her what soon came to be the fixed opinion of the men, that all those saved were on the Carpathia. Reader's note: the following are captions to various photographs. Photo by Underwood and Underwood, New York. Captain Smith of the Titanic, who heroically did all he could do to save women and children, and then, like the true hero he was, went down with his ship. Colonel John Jacob Astor, grandson of the founder of the Astor family in America. After putting his young bride in a lifeboat, he remained on the ship and died as a hero. Photo by Paul Thompson, New York. Cunard Line steamship Carpathia, which heard the wireless call of distress and was first to reach the scene of the disaster and take on board the survivors who were found in the lifeboats. Rescued passengers in one of the Titanic's collapsible lifeboats, waiting to be taken aboard the Carpathia. Scene on the upper deck of the Titanic, showing lifeboats as they are carried by all steamships. All the passengers could have been saved if this ship had carried 3 times as many lifeboats. Wireless operator sending messages. But for the wireless, the Titanic's passengers would surely have all been lost, as they could not have survived in small boats with ice all around them. Mrs. John Jacob Astor, bride of Colonel Astor, who went down with the Titanic. Photo by Harris and Ewing, Washington, D.C. Major Archibald Butt, the famous military aide of two presidents, Roosevelt and Taft. He battled for the rescue of women and children until the last lifeboat had left the ship, and then went down with the Titanic like a true hero. One of the deluxe rooms on the Titanic. Such were occupied by John Jacob Astor and his bride, and many other multimillionaires who went down with the ship. Photo by Underwood and Underwood, New York. View of the promenade deck of the ill-fated White Star liner Titanic. This deck extends nearly the whole length of the ship, and is used as a promenade for passengers. Part of the magnificent concert room of the steamship Titanic, where women passengers spent much of their time in reading and listening to the music. Luxuriously furnished smoking room of the Titanic, where men spent many social hours before going to their watery graves. Photo by Paul Thompson, New York. Captain Smith of the Titanic, who saved many women and children, and then, like a true hero, went down with his ship. This picture also shows two of his officers. Photo by Underwood and Underwood, New York. Interior of Cunard Line Pier, all cleared out, ready to receive the survivors of the Titanic on arrival of the Carpathia, where they were met by relatives, physicians, nurses, and others. Photo by Underwood and Underwood, New York. A most remarkable photograph taken by a passenger on the Carpathia, showing Mr. and Mrs. Harder, a young honeymoon couple. When the cry came to get in the lifeboats, they, as a lark, thinking there was no danger, jumped in the first boat lowered. J. Bruce Ismay, White Star Line manager. Mr. Ismay was on the Titanic, and has been severely criticized for his actions in connection with this great calamity. "I feel better," Mrs. Futrell said hours afterward, "for I can cry now." Among the men, conversation centered on the accident and the responsibility for it. Many expressed a belief that the Titanic, in common with other vessels, had had warning of the ice packs, but that in the effort to establish a record on the maiden run, sufficient heed had not been paid to the warnings. The failure of the safety compartments, said to have been closed from the bridge directly after the accident, was the occasion of amazement, and one theory offered was that the doors had, for some reason, not closed in the usual manner. Others contended that these devices are, at best, but time savers, and said that without them the Titanic would have gone under before 3 boats could have been lowered. The officers' requirements discussed. The requirement that the officers on the bridge should take temperatures of the water every 15 minutes to indicate the approach of ice was also discussed. As to the behavior of officers and crew, not a word of complaint was heard from the men. They were praised as worthy Britons and true seamen. In the same breath, the survivors exalted the heroism of the missing men of the first cabin, who had stood calmly waiting for their turn. The turn which, because of scarcity of boats and shortness of time, never came for most of them. "God knows I'm not proud to be here," said a rich New York man. "I got on a boat when they were about to lower it, and when, from delays below, there was no woman to take the vacant place. I don't think any man who was saved is deserving of censure, but I realize that, in contrast with those who went down, we may be viewed unfavorably." He showed a picture of his baby boy as he spoke. As the day passed, the fore part of the ship assumed some degree of order and comfort, but the crowded second cabin and decks gave forth the incessant sound of lamentation. A bride of 2 months sat on the floor and moaned her widowhood. An Italian mother shrieked the name of her lost son. A girl of 7 wept over the loss of her teddy bear and 2 dolls, while her mother, with streaming eyes, dared not tell the child that her father was lost too, and that the money for which their home in England had been sold had gone down with him. Other children clung to the necks of the fathers who, because carrying them, had been permitted to take the boats. At 4 p.m. Monday, the service for the dead was read by Father Roger Anderson of the Episcopal Order of the Holy Cross, over the bodies of 3 seamen and 1 man, said to have been a cabin passenger, who were dead from exposure when received on this ship. Some of the Titanic's passengers turned away from the rail as the first of the weighted forms fell into the water. The Titans, by Richard J. Beamish. And most who drowned were men. 'Tis good to read these strong, fair words. They tell of manhood tried, of those who saw the weak ones safe, then died. Rake muck, sneer slurs. You can't paint black the breed that smiled at death in that heroic deed. Poor men forgot their lot, the rich their pride. Like gods they struggled o'er the rising tide for others' lives, their own they scorned to heed. Then kindly night shut out their tragedy. God send the words to flame their message through the grieving world. For inasmuch as ye help thus my helpless ones, ye helpeth me. They sleep where love and death both found them true, their names as deathless as their shrine, the sea. End of section 1.
The next day, caring for the sick, meeting of the survivors, personal wireless messages given precedence, Marconi's appeal fruitless, quartermaster tells story. The writer's narrative continues. In the hospital and the public rooms lay, in blankets, several others who have been benumbed by the water. Mrs. Rosa Abbott, who was in the water for hours, was restored during the day. G. Wilkin, the Titanic's barber, who declared he was blown off the ship by the second of the two explosions after the crash, was treated for bruises. A passenger, who was thoroughly ducked before being picked up, caused much amusement on this ship, soon after the doctors were through with him by demanding a bath. Storekeeper Prentice, the last man off the Titanic to reach this ship, was also soon over the effects of his long swim in the icy waters, into which he leaped from the poop deck. The physicians of the Carpathia were praised, as was Chief Steward Hughes, for work done in making the arrivals comfortable and averting serious illness. Monday night on the Carpathia was one of rest. The wailing and sobbing of the day were hushed as the widows and orphans slept. Tuesday, save for the crowded condition of the ship, matters took somewhat their normal appearance. Tuesday afternoon in the saloon, a meeting of survivors was held, and plans for a testimonial to the officers and crew of the Carpathia and the survivors of the Titanic crew were discussed. It was decided that relief of the destitute should first be considered, and the chairman of the meeting, Samuel Goldberg, appointed a committee consisting of I. G. Fruenthal, Mrs. J. J. Brown, William Bushnell, and George Stone to raise a fund. The first subscriptions were $100 each, and the amounts were paid largely in travelers' checks or personal checks, cash being somewhat scarce among the refugees who had kept their currency in the purser's safe. Resolutions were adopted praising the Titanic's surviving officers and crew, and the officers, crew, and passengers of the Carpathia, and declaring that a memorial is needed for those who in heroic self-sacrifice made possible the rescue of so many others. One speaker suggested that a memorial fund be raised by popular subscription, mentioning the world as a suitable medium. This and other suggestions were left to the committee to develop. Rain and fog marked the Carpathia's homeward course, and those who were not seasick when New York was reached were none the less sick of the sea. Captain Rostrom's rule that personal messages should take precedence of press messages was not relaxed, even when Tuesday a message from Guglielmo Marconi himself asked the reason why press dispatches were not sent. The captain posted Marconi's message on the bulletin board, and beside it a bulletin stating that no press messages, except a bulletin to the Associated Press, had been sent. The implication was that none would be sent, and the most urgent and respectful appeals failed to change his determination, which he seemed convinced was in the best interest of the survivors and their friends. My wife was my only active helper in a task which 10 newspaper men could not have performed completely. Mr. S. B. Silverthorne of St. Louis aided greatly by lending me his first cabin passenger list, one of the few in existence. Robert Hitchens, one of the surviving quartermasters of the Titanic, the man who was on duty at the wheel when the ship struck the iceberg, told me the tale of the wreck on the Carpathia Thursday. Save for the surviving fourth officer, Boxhall, whose lips are sealed, Hitchens saw Sunday night's tragedy at closer range than any man now living. In the hastily compiled list of surviving members of the crew, the names of Hitchens and other quartermasters appear among the able-bodied seamen, but the star and anchor on the left sleeve of each distinguishes them in rank from the A.B.s. Hitchens has followed the sea 15 years and has a wife and 2 children in Southampton. His tale of the wreck, as he told it to me, and as he expects to tell it to a Marine Court of Inquiry, is here given. I went on watch at 8 o'clock Sunday night and stood by the man at the wheel until 10. At 10 I took the wheel for 2 hours. On the bridge from 10 o'clock on were First Officer Murdoch, Fourth Officer Boxhall, and Sixth Officer Moody. In the crow's nest lookout tower were Fleet and another man whose name I don't know. Second Officer on watch. Second Officer Light Oiler, who was on watch while I stood by, carrying messages in the lake from 8 to 10, sent me soon after 8 to tell the carpenter to look out for the fresh water supply as it might be in danger of freezing. The temperature was then 31 degrees. He gave the crow's nest a strict order to look out for small icebergs. Second Officer Lightoller was relieved by First Officer Murdoch at 10, and I took the wheel then. At 11:40, 3 gongs sounded from the crow's nest to signal for something right ahead. At the same time, one of the men in the nest telephoned to the bridge that there was a large iceberg right ahead. As Officer Murdoch's hand was on the lever to stop the engines, the crash came. He stopped the engines, then immediately by another lever closed the watertight doors. The skipper, Captain Smith, came from the chart room onto the bridge. His first words were, "Close the emergency doors." "They're already closed, sir," Mr. Murdoch replied. "Send to the carpenter and tell him to sound the ship," was the skipper's next order. The message was sent to the carpenter. The carpenter never came up to report. He was probably the first man on that ship to lose his life. The skipper looked at the commutator, which shows in what direction the ship is listing. He saw that he carried 5 degrees list to the starboard. The ship was then rapidly settling forward. All the steam sirens were blowing. By the skipper's orders, given in the next few minutes, the engines were put to work at pumping out the ship. Distress signals were sent by Marconi, and rockets were sent up from the bridge by Quartermaster Rowe. All hands were ordered on deck, and life belts were sewed to the crew and to every passenger. The stewards and other hands helped the sailors in getting the boats out. The order, "Women and children first," was given and enforced. There was no panic. I was at the wheel until 12:25. It was my duty to stay there until relieved. I was not relieved by anyone else, but was simply sent away by Second Officer Lightoller, who told me to take charge of a certain boat and load it with ladies. I did so, and there were 32 ladies, a sailor and myself in the boat, when it was lowered some time after 1 o'clock. I can't be sure of the time. All boats but one get away safely. The Titanic had 16 lifeboats and 2 collapsible boats. All of them got away loaded, except that one of the collapsibles did not open properly and was used as a raft. 40 sailors and stewards, who were floating in the water, got on this raft, and later had to abandon the raft and were picked up by different boats. Some others were floating about on chairs when picked up. Every boat, so far as I saw, was full when it was lowered, and every boat that set out reached the Carpathia. The green light on one of the boats helped to keep us together, but there were other lights. One was an electric flashlight that a gentleman had carried in his pocket. Our boat was 400 yards away when the ship went down. The suction nearby must have been terrific, but we were only rocked somewhat. I have told only what I know, and what I shall tell any Marine court that may examine me. G. Whitman of Palmyra, New Jersey, the Titanic's barber, was lowering boats on Deck A after the collision, and declares the officers on the bridge, one of them Second Officer Murdoch, promptly worked the electrical apparatus for closing the watertight compartments. He believes the machinery was in some way so damaged by the crash that the front compartments failed to close tightly, although the rear ones were secure. Whitman's manner of escape was unique. He was blown off the deck by the second of the 2 explosions of the boilers, and was in the water more than 2 hours before he was picked up by a raft. The explosions, Whitman said, were caused by the rushing in of the icy water on the boilers. A bundle of deck chairs, roped together, was blown off the deck with me and struck my back, injuring my spine, but it served as a temporary raft. The crew and passengers had faith in the bulkhead system to save the ship, and we were lowering a bent-on collapsible boat, all confident the ship would get through, when she took a terrific dip forward and the water rushed in and swept over the deck and onto the engine rooms. Blown 15 feet. The bow went clean down, and I caught the pile of chairs as I was washed up against the rail. Then came the explosions and blew me 15 feet. After the water had filled the forward compartments, the ones at the stern could not save her. They did delay the ship's going down. If it wasn't for the compartments, hardly anyone would have got away. The water was too cold for me to swim, and I was hardly more than 100 feet away when the ship went down. The suction was not what one expects and only rocked the water around me. I was picked up after 2 hours. I have done with the sea. Whitman was one of those who heard the ship's string band playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee" a few moments before she went down. R. Norris Williams, a Philadelphia youth on his way home from England to take the Harvard entrance examinations, was one of the few saloon passengers at the rail excluded by the women first order from the boats who was saved. His father, Dwayne Williams, was lost. "There is much, and yet there is little to tell of my experience," said young Williams. "My father and I had given up our hope for life and were standing together, resolved to jump together and keep together if we could, so as long as either of us lived. I had on my fur coat. The forward end where we stood was sinking rapidly, and before we could jump together the water washed my father over. Then with the explosions the ship seemed to break in two, and the forward end bounded up again for an instant. I leaped, but with dozens in the water between us, my father was lost to me." Swam and drifted nearly 2 hours. "I swam and drifted nearly 2 hours before I was pulled aboard the raft or collapsible boat which served for a time as a raft. Later, with the abandonment of the raft, I was taken aboard a boat." Frederick K. Seward, who sat next to W.T. Stead at the Titanic saloon table, told of the veteran English journalist's plans for his American visit. His immediate purpose was to aid in the New York campaign of the Men and Religion Forward movement. "Mr. Stead talked much of spiritualism, thought transfer, and the occult," said Seward. "He told the story of a mummy case in the British Museum which, he said, had had amazing adventures, but which punished with great calamities any person who wrote of its story. He told one person after another who, he said, had come to grieve after writing the story, and added, although he knew it, he would never write it. He did not say whether ill luck attached to the mere telling of it." Steed also told, Seward said, of a strange adventure of a young woman with an admirer in an English railroad coach, which was known to him as it happened, and which he afterward repeated to the young woman, amazing her by repeating everything correctly, save for one small detail. Had Harold Cotton, Marconi operator on the Carpathia, gone to bed Sunday night at his usual time, the Carpathia would have known nothing of the Titanic's plight, and the lifeboats, without food or water, might have been the scenes of even greater tragedy than the great death ship itself. The Carpathia, an easy-going Mediterranean ship, has only one Marconi man, and when Cotton had not the receiver on his head, the ship was out of communication with the world. Cotton, an Englishman of 21 years, told me the morning after the wreck how he came to receive the Titanic's CQD. "Just about to turn in when called by CQD. I was relaying a message to the Titanic Sunday night, shortly after 11 o'clock by my time," he said, and told Phillips, the Titanic's Marconi man, that I had been doing quite a bit of work for him, and that if he had nothing else for me, I would quit and turn in for the night. Just as I was about to take the receiver off my head came CQD. This was followed with, "We've hit something. Come at once." I called a sailor and sent word to an officer, and a few minutes later the captain turned the Carpathia at 18 knots in the direction of the Titanic, which was 60 miles or more from us. Before I could tell the Titanic we were coming, came their SOS, and the operator added, "I'm afraid we're gone." I told him we were coming, and he went on sending out signals in every direction. An assistant Marconi man from the Titanic, not on duty at the time of the wreck, was among the survivors and assisted Cotton in his work after Wednesday, having been laid up the 2 previous days by the shock of the chill he suffered in the water and by injuries to his legs. He denied a report generally circulated on this ship that Jack Benz, of Republic fame, was on the Titanic. He said Phillips, the Titanic's chief operator, was lost. Mrs. Edward S. Robert, whose husband, a leading St. Louis attorney, died last December during her absence in England, and her daughter, Miss Georgette Madale, have been in close seclusion on the Carpathia since their rescue from the Titanic. They are accompanied by Mrs. Roberts' maid. S.V. Silverthorne, buyer for Nugent's, was one of 3 or 4 saloon passengers on the Titanic who saw the deadly iceberg just after the collision. "I was in the smoking room reading near a bridge whist game at one of the tables," he said, "when the crash came. I said, 'We hit something,' and went out to the starboard side to look. None of us was alarmed. It occurred to me we might have bumped a whale, or at most ran down some small craft. Ordered on deck, and told to get into the boats. I went back in the smoking room with the others. One of the bridge players had not left the smoking room at all and was waiting impatiently for the others to come back and resume the game. They returned and took up their hands, and were all about to settle down when an officer ordered us on deck and told us to get into the boats, there not being enough women on deck to fill the first ones. We didn't like the idea of leaving the ship then, but did as we were told. Had we been in our rooms, we would have had to stand aside, as other men did then. 2 orphan French boys, about 2 and 4 years old respectively, whose surname I believe to be Hoffman, and who called each other Louis and Lolo, will be cared for by Miss Margaret Hayes of 304 West 83rd Street, New York, while efforts will be made to find the relatives to whom their father was thought to have been taking them. The elder boy has been ill with a fever for 3 days, the excitement, exposure, and probably grief over the loss of his father having told on the little fellow. The other, too young to realize what has befallen him, played around the saloon or sat contentedly in the lap of one of his new-made but devoted friends among the passengers. The father, who is in the list of second cabin passengers as Mr. Hoffman, is said to have told fellow passengers on the Titanic the children's mother died recently. Mrs. Sylvia Caldwell, of Bangkok, Siam, is happy in having her husband and little son. Since she was the last woman to embark, her husband was able to come with her. Mrs. Esther Hart, whose husband was lost, was coming, with her daughter Eva, to visit Mr. Hart's sister in New York, then go on to Winnipeg to make their home. They had sold the property at Ilford, Essex, England. All their money was lost when Mr. Hart went down with the Titanic. Mrs. Lucy Risdale, of London, had said goodbye to England and started for Marietta, Ohio, to make her home with her sisters. She was saved with the few clothes she wore. She had written letters telling of a safe arrival and pleasant voyage, and had them ready to mail. They went down with the ship. End of section 2. Suffering in the lifeboats. Statement by Ismay. Would not desert husband. 30 on raft in icy water. Colonel Astor, a hero. Joked over collision. Officer saves many lives. But another account, compiled from various sources among the survivors, gives somewhat varying angles and supplies quite a few missing details. At the risk of a few slight repetitions, it is given: of the great facts that stand out from the chaotic accounts of the tragedy, these are the most salient. The death list was increased rather than decreased. 6 persons died after being rescued. The list of prominent persons lost stood as first reported. Practically every woman and child, with the exception of those women who refused to leave their husbands, were saved. Among the last was Mrs. Isidore Strauss. The survivors in the lifeboat saw the lights on the stricken vessel glimmer to the last, heard her band playing, and saw the doomed hundreds on her deck, and heard their groans and cries when the vessel sank. Accounts vary as to the extent of the disorder on board. Not only was the Titanic tearing through the April night to her doom, with every ounce of steam crowded on, but she was under orders from the general officers of the line to make all the speed of which she was capable. This was the statement made by J.H. Moody, a quartermaster of the vessel and helmsman, on the night of the disaster. He said the ship was making 21 knots an hour, and the officers were striving to live up to the orders to smash the records. It was close to midnight, said Moody, and I was on the bridge with the second officer, who was in command. Suddenly he shouted, "Port your helm!" I did so, but it was too late. We struck the submerged portion of the berg. Of the many accounts given by the passengers, most of them agreed that the shock when the Titanic struck the iceberg, although ripping her great sides like a giant can opener, did not greatly jar the entire vessel, for the blow was a glancing one along her side. The accounts also agree substantially that when the passengers were taking off on the lifeboats, there was no serious panic, and that many wished to remain on board the Titanic, believing her to be unsinkable. Experiences of passengers in lifeboats. The most distressing stories are those giving the experiences of the passengers in lifeboats. They tell not only of their own suffering, but give the harrowing details of how they saw the great hulk of the Titanic stand on end, stern uppermost for many minutes, before plunging to the bottom, As this spectacle was witnessed by groups of survivors in the boats, they plainly saw many of those whom they had just left behind leaping from the decks into the water. J. Bruce Ismay, president of the International Mercantile Marine, owners of the White Star Line, who was among the 70-odd men saved, P.A.S. Franklin, vice president of the White Star Line, and United States Senator William Alden Smith, chairman of the Senate Investigating Committee, held a conference aboard the Carpathia soon after the passengers had come ashore. After nearly an hour, Senator Smith came out of the cabin and said he had no authority to subpoena witnesses at this time, but would begin an investigation into the cause of the loss of the Titanic at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel the next day. He announced that Mr. Ismay had consented to appear at the hearing, and Mr. Franklin and the 4 surviving officers of the Titanic would appear for examination by the Senate committee. He said that the course the investigation would follow would be determined after the preliminary hearing. Senator Smith was questioned as to the speed the Titanic was proceeding at when she crashed into the iceberg. He said he had asked Mr. Ismay, but declined to say what Mr. Ismay's reply was. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the International Mercantile Marine, gave out the following prepared statement on the pier. In the presence and under the shadow of a catastrophe so overwhelming, my feelings are too deep for expression in words, and I can only say that the White Star Line officers and employees will do everything humanly possible to alleviate the suffering and sorrow of the relatives and friends of those who perished. The Titanic was the last word in shipbuilding. Every regulation prescribed by the British Board of Trade had been strictly complied with. The master, officers, and crew were the most experienced and skillful in the British service. I am informed that a committee of the United States Senate has been appointed to investigate the circumstances of the accident. I heartily welcome the most complete and exhaustive inquiry, and any aid that I can render is at the service of the public and of the government of both the United States and Great Britain. Under these circumstances, I must defer making any further statement at this hour. Mr. Ismay said informally before giving out his statement that he left the ship in one of the last boats, one of the collapsible boats on the port side. This statement, however, as will appear, is scathingly denounced by several survivors as untrue. I do not know the speed at which the Titanic was going, said Mr. Ismay in reply to a question. She hit the iceberg a glancing blow. Mr. Ismay, after his interview with Senator Smith, said that he was desirous of sailing on the Carpathia the next afternoon. The Carpathia was scheduled to sail at 4 o'clock. Mr. Ismay assured the senators, however, that he would make a complete statement of the catastrophe, and that if he could not finish in time for the sailing, he would change his plans. Mr. Ismay then went to his apartments at the Ritz-Carlton. The arrival of the Carpathia brought a vast multitude of people to the Cunard docks. They filled the vast pier sheds, and overflowing for blocks, crowded the nearby streets in a dense throng. Through it all the rain fell steadily, adding a funeral aspect to the scene. The landing of the survivors was attended with little excitement, the crowd standing in awe-like silence as the groups from the ship passed along. The docking actually began shortly after 9 o'clock, and the debarking of passengers was so quickly disposed of by the waiving of the usual formality that practically everything had been concluded by 10:30 o'clock. The crowds remained about the pier long after this, however, to get a glimpse of the rescuing steamer and to hear the harrowing stories which had been brought back by the ship. Colonel Archibald Gracie, USA, the last man saved, went down with the vessel, but was picked up. He was met by his daughter, who had arrived from Washington, and his son-in-law, Paul H. Fabricius. Colonel Gracie told a remarkable story of personal hardship and denied emphatically the reports that there had been any panic on board. He praised in the highest terms the behavior of both the passengers and crew and paid a high tribute to the heroism of the women passengers. Contrary to the general expectation, there was no jarring impact when the vessel struck, according to the Army officer. He was in his berth when the vessel smashed into the submerged portion of the berg and was aroused by the jar. He looked at his watch, he said, and found it was just midnight. The ship sank with him at 2:22 a.m., for his watch stopped at that hour. Would not desert her husband. Mrs. Isidore Strauss, he said, went to her death because she would not desert her husband, although he pleaded with her to take her place in the boat. She steadfastly refused, and when the ship settled at the head, the two were engulfed by the wave that swept her. Colonel Gracie told of how he was driven to the topmost deck when the ship settled, and was the sole survivor after the wave that swept her just before her final plunge. "I jumped with the wave," said he, "just as I have often jumped with the breakers at the seashore. By great fortune, I managed to grasp the brass railing at the deck above, and I hung on by might and main. When the ship plunged down, I was forced to let go, and I was swirled around and around for what seemed to be an interminable time. Eventually I came to the surface, to find the sea a mass of tangled wreckage. Luckily I was unhurt, and casting about, managed to seize a wooden grating floating nearby. When I had recovered my breath, I discovered a larger canvas and cork life craft which had floated up. A man, whose name I did not learn, was struggling toward it from some wreckage to which he had clung. I cast off and helped him to get on the raft, and we then began the work of rescuing those who had jumped into the sea and were floundering in the water. When dawn broke, there were 30 of us on the raft, standing knee-deep in the icy water and afraid to move lest the cranky craft be overturned. Several, unfortunately, benumbed and half dead, besought us to save them, and 1 or 2 made an effort to reach us. The hours that elapsed before we were picked up by the Carpathia were the longest and most terrible that I ever spent. Practically without any sensation of feeling, because of the icy water, we were almost dropping from fatigue. We were afraid to turn around to look to see whether we were seen by passing craft, and when someone who was facing astern passed the word that something that looked like a steamer was coming up, one of the men became hysterical under the strain. The rest of us, too, were nearing the breaking point. Denies that any men were fired upon. Colonel Gracie denied with emphasis that any men were fired upon, and declared that only once was a revolver discharged. This was for the purpose of intimidating some steerage passengers, he said, who had tumbled into a boat before it was prepared for launching. This shot was fired in the air, and when the foreigners were told that the next would be directed at them, they promptly returned to the deck. There was no confusion and no panic. "Before I retired," said Colonel Gracie, "I had a long chat with Charles H. Hayes, president of the Grand Trunk Railroad. One of the last things Mr. Hayes said was this: the White Star, the Cunard, and the Hamburg American lines are devoting their attention and ingenuity in vying with the other to attain the supremacy in luxurious ships and making speed records. The time will soon come when this will be checked by some appalling disaster. Poor fellow, a few hours later he was dead." The conduct of Colonel Jacob Astor was deserving of the highest praise, Colonel Gracie declared. The millionaire New Yorker, he said, devoted all his energies to saving his young bride, nee Miss Force of New York, who was in delicate health. "Colonel Astor helped us in our efforts to get her into the boat," said Colonel Gracie. "I lifted her into the boat, and as she took her place, Colonel Astor requested permission of the officer to go with her for her own protection. "No, sir," replied the officer. "Not a man shall go on a boat until the women are all off." Colonel Astor then inquired the number of the boat, which was being lowered away, and turned to the work of clearing the other boats and reassuring the frightened and nervous women. By this time the ship began to list frightfully to port. This became so dangerous that the second officer ordered everyone to rush to starboard. This we did, and we found the crew trying to get a boat off in that quarter. Here I saw the last of John B. Thayer and George B. Widener of Philadelphia. Speed kept up despite warnings. Colonel Gracie said that, despite the warnings of icebergs, no slowing down of speed was ordered by the commander of the Titanic. There were other warnings, too, he said. In the 24 hours run ending the 14th, he said, the ship's run was 546 miles, and we were told that the next 24 hours would see even a better record posted. No diminution of speed was indicated in the run, and the engines kept up their steady running. When Sunday evening came, we all noticed the increased cold, which gave plain warning that the ship was in close proximity to icebergs or ice fields. The officers, I am credibly informed, had been advised by wireless from other ships of the presence of icebergs and dangerous floes in that vicinity. The sea was as smooth as glass, and the weather clear, so it seems that there was no occasion for fear. When the vessel struck, he continued, the passengers were so little alarmed that they joked over the matter. The few that appeared on deck early had taken their time to dress properly, and there was not the slightest indication of panic. Some of the fragments of ice had fallen on the deck, and those were picked up and passed around by some of the more facetious ones, who offered them as mementos of the occasion. On the port side, a glance over the side failed to show any evidence of damage, and the vessel seemed to be on an even keel. James Clinch Smith and I, however, soon found the vessel was listing heavily. A few minutes later, the officers ordered men and women to don life preservers. E.Z. Taylor of Philadelphia, one of the survivors, jumped into the sea just 3 minutes before the boat sank. He told a graphic story as he came from the Carpathia. "I was eating when the boat struck the iceberg," he said. "There was an awful shock that made the boat tremble from stem to stern. I did not realize for some time what had happened. No one seemed to know the extent of the accident. We were told that an iceberg had been struck by the ship. I felt the boat rise, and it seemed to me that she was riding over the ice." Rocking over a veritable sea of ice. I ran out on the deck, and then I could see ice. It was a veritable sea of ice, and the boat was rocking over it. I should say that parts of the iceberg were 80 feet high, but it had been broken into sections, probably by our ship. I jumped into the ocean and was picked up by one of the boats. I never expected to see land again. I waited on board the boat until the lights went out. It seemed to me that the discipline on board was wonderful. A young Englishwoman, who requested her name be omitted, told a thrilling story of her experience collapsible boats, which had been manned by 8 of the crew from the Titanic. The boat was in command of the 5th officer, H. Lowe, whose actions she described as saving the lives of many people. Before the lifeboat was launched, he passed along the port deck of the steamer, commanding the people not to jump into the boats, and otherwise restraining them from swamping the craft. When the collapsible was launched, Officer Lowe succeeded in putting up a mast and a small sail. He collected other boats together. In some cases the boats were short of adequate crews, and he directed an exchange by which each was adequately manned. He threw lines connecting the boats together, 2 by 2, and all thus moved together. Later on he went back to the wreck with the crew of one of the boats, and succeeded in picking up some of those who had jumped overboard and were swimming about. On his way back to the Carpathia, he passed one of the collapsible boats, which was on the point of sinking with 30 passengers aboard, most of them in scant night clothing. They were rescued just in the nick of time. Among the first passengers off the Carpathia was Mrs. Paul Shabert of Derby, Connecticut. She said that she had a stateroom on the port side and had sailed with her brother Philip. Mrs. Shabert declared that her brother was saved because she refused to leave him. In the general panic came the cry, "Ladies first." "It was a terrible experience," Mrs. Shabert added. "I was awakened by the shock of the collision and went out on deck. There was very little excitement, and persons were coming from their rooms asking what had happened. Suddenly from the bridge came the cry, 'Ladies first.' This was the first inkling we had the ship was in danger. I went back to my stateroom and dressed, and then as I returned to the deck I heard the horrifying order that women must leave their husbands and brothers. I refused to leave my brother, and finally he was shoved into the boat with me." Mrs. Isidore Strauss, who had a stateroom near me, and with whom I had frequently talked, declared that under no circumstances would she leave Mr. Strauss. As we pushed away from the Titanic, the ship started to go down, and as she disappeared beneath the water, Mr. and Mrs. Strauss were standing arm in arm. Mrs. D.W. Marvin, who was on a honeymoon trip with her husband, was almost prostrated when she reached the deck and learned that her husband had not been picked up by some other boat. "My God, don't ask me too much," she said. "Tell me, have you any news from Dan? He grabbed me in his arms and knocked down men to get me into the boat. As I was put into the boat, he cried, 'It's all right, little girl. You go, and I will stay a while. I'll put on a life preserver and jump off and follow your boat.' As our boat shoved off, he threw a kiss at me, and that was the last I saw of him." Edward Bean of Glasgow, Scotland, who with his wife occupied a stateroom in the second cabin, declared that 15 minutes after the Titanic hit the iceberg, there was an explosion in the engine room, which was followed in a few minutes by a second explosion. False report of passenger being shot. "The stern of the boat floated for nearly an hour after the bow was submerged," said Mr. Bean, "and then went down. I heard a report that 2 steerage passengers were shot by officers when they started to crowd into the boats, but later this was denied. Max Falliker-Stelly, who with his wife and his daughter Margaret was on his way to the city to visit a brother, said, 'My wife and 2 women entered one of the first boats lowered. 12 men, including myself, were standing near, and as there were no other women passengers waiting, we were ordered to get in. The sea was calm. We were rowed by 4 seamen, one of whom was in charge.'" The order maintained on the Titanic was what I would call remarkable. There was very little pushing, and in most cases it was the women who caused the commotion by insisting that their husbands go with them into the lifeboats. As a rule, the men were very orderly. It was not until we had left the ship that many of the women showed fright. From that time on, however, they filled the air with shrieks. The following statement, issued by a committee of the surviving passengers, was given the press on the arrival of the Carpathia. "We, the undersigned surviving passengers of the SS Titanic, in order to forestall any sensational or exaggerated statements, deem it our duty to give the press a statement of facts which have come to our knowledge and which we believe to be true." On Sunday, April 14th, 1912, at about 11:40 p.m., on a cold starlit night, in a smooth sea and with no moon, the ship struck an iceberg, which had been reported by the bridge by the lookouts, but not early enough to avoid collision. Steps were taken to ascertain the damage and save passengers and ship. Orders were given to put on life belts, and the boats were lowered. The ship sank about 2:20 a.m. Monday, and the usual distress signals were sent out by wireless and rockets fired at intervals from the ship. Fortunately, the wireless message was received by the Cunard's SS Carpathia at about 12 o'clock, and she arrived on the scene of the disaster at about 4 a.m. Monday. The officers and crew of the SS Carpathia had been preparing all night for the rescue and comfort of the survivors, and the last mentioned were received on board with the most touching care and kindness, every attention being given to all, irrespective of class. The passengers, officers, and crew gave up gladly their staterooms, clothing, and comforts for our benefit. All honor to them. On the boat at the time of the collision was first class 330, second class 320, third class 750, total 1,400. Officers and crew 940, total 2,340. Of the foregoing, about the following were rescued by SS Carpathia: first class 210, second class 125, third class 200, officers 4, seamen 39, stewards 96, firemen 71, total 210 of the crew. The net total of 745 saved was about 80% of the maximum capacity of the lifeboats. We feel it our duty to call the attention of the public to what we consider the inadequate supply of life-saving appliances provided for on modern passenger steamships, and recommend that immediate steps be taken to compel passenger steamers to carry sufficient boats to accommodate the maximum number of people carried on board. The following facts were observed and should be considered in this connection: the insufficiency of lifeboats, rafts, etc., lack of trained seamen to man same, stokers, stewards, etc., are not efficient boat handlers, not enough officers to carry out emergency orders on the bridge and superintend the launching and control of lifeboats, absence of searchlights. The Board of Trade rules allow for entirely too many people in each boat to permit the same to be properly handled. On the Titanic, the boat deck was about 75 feet above water, and consequently the passengers were required to embark before lowering boats, thus endangering the operation and preventing the taking on of the maximum number the boats would hold. Boats at all times to be properly equipped with provisions, water, lamps, compasses, lights, etc. Life-saving boat drills should be more frequent and thoroughly carried out, and officers should be armed at boat drills. Greater reduction in speed in fog and ice, as damage, if collision actually occurs, is liable to be less. In conclusion, we suggest that an international conference be called to recommend the passage of identical laws providing for the safety of all at sea, and we urge the United States government to take the initiative as soon as possible. The statement was signed by Samuel Goldenberg, Chairman, and Committee of Passengers. End of Section 3.
Tardy answer to telephone call. Lookout signals not answered. Ship could have been saved. 3 fatal minutes. Ismay accused. Women help with oars. Ship broken in two. Band played till last. The trifle of a telephone call, hardly answered, sent the Titanic to the bottom of the Atlantic, occasioned the greatest marine disaster in history, and shocked all civilized nations. This, at least, is the tale told by sailors of the ill-starred Titanic, brawny seamen who only lived to tell it because it happened in the line of their duty to help man the boats into which some of the Titanic's passengers were loaded. But the telephone call that went unanswered for probably 2 or 3 minutes, none can tell the exact time, was sent by the lookout stationed forward to the first officer of the watch on the bridge of the great liner on the maiden voyage. The lookout saw a towering blue berg looming up in the sea path of the Titanic, the latest and proudest product of marine architecture, and called the bridge on the ship's telephone. When, after the passing of those 2 or 3 fateful minutes, an officer on the bridge of the Titanic lifted the telephone receiver from its hook to answer the lookout, it was too late. The speeding liner, cleaving a calm sea under a star-studded sky, had reached the floating mountain of ice, which the theoretically unsinkable ship struck a crashing, if glancing blow with her starboard bow. Had the officer on the bridge, who was William T. Murdoch, according to the account of the tragedy given by 2 of the Titanic's seamen, known how imperative was that call from the lookout man, whose name was given as Fleet, the man at the wheel of the world's newest and greatest transatlantic liner might have swerved the great ship sufficiently to avoid the berg altogether, or at the worst would have probably struck the mass of ice with her stern, and at much reduced speed. For obvious reasons, the identity of the sailorman who described the foundering of the Titanic cannot be divulged. As for the officer, who was alleged to have been a laggard in answering the lookout's telephone call, harsh criticism may be omitted. Murdoch, if the tale of the Titanic sailor be true, expiated his negligence, if negligence it was, by shooting himself within sight of all alleged victims huddled in lifeboats or struggling in the icy seas. The unwritten law of the sea. The revolver which the sailors say snuffed out Murdoch's life was not the only weapon that rang out above the shrieks of the drowning. Officers of the Titanic, upon whom devolved the duty of seeing that the unwritten law of the sea, women and children first, was enforced, were, according to the recital of the members of the great liner's crew, forced to shoot frenzied male passengers, who, impelled by the fear of death, attempted to get into the lifeboats swinging from their davits. The sailor's account of the terrific impact of the Titanic against the berg that crossed the path was as follows. It was 11:40 p.m. Sunday, April 14. Struck an iceberg. The berg was very dark and about 250 feet in height. The Titanic struck the berg a glancing blow on the starboard bow. The ship, which was traveling between 20 and 23 knots an hour, crashed into the berg at a point about 40 feet back of the stem. The Titanic's bottom was torn away to about forebridge. The tear was fully 50 feet in length and was below the water line. Regarding the state of the sea and the character of the night, the sailors declared, "It was a perfect night, clear and starlight. The sea was smooth. The temperature had dropped to freezing Sunday morning. We knew or believed that the cold was due to the nearness of bergs, but we had not even run against cake ice up to the time the ice mountain loomed up. The Titanic raced through a calm sea, in which there was no ice, into the berg which sank her." Continuing their joint account, the 2 men of the Titanic's crew further said, "The first officer of the watch was Murdoch. He was on the bridge. Captain Smith may have been near at hand, but he was not visible to us who were about to wash down the decks. Hitchens, quartermaster, was at the wheel. Fleet was the outlook." It's characteristic of sailors that they make no effort to learn the baptismal names of a ship's officers. Fleet reported the berg, but the telephone was not answered on the bridge at once. A few minutes afterwards the telephone call was answered, but it was too late. The ship had struck. The ship had struck. Murdoch, after the ship struck the berg, gave orders to put helm to starboard. Afterwards he ordered the helm hard to port, and the ship struck the berg again. Afterwards Murdoch gave an order for the carpenter to sound the wells to learn how much water the ship was taking in. The carpenter came up and told Murdoch the Titanic had 7 feet of water in her in less than 7 minutes. Keeping on with their narrative, the sailors, whose nerves had not been broken by their experiences, declared, "Then Captain Smith, who had put in an appearance, gave orders to get the boats ready. There was less than 10 minutes between the time the Titanic first struck the berg and the second crash, both of which brought big pieces of ice showering down on the ship. Orders came to the crew to stand by the boats. The boats were got out. There were 22 boats all told." At this juncture the sailors described, without apparent prejudice or bitterness, how J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the board of directors of the White Star Line, was the first to leave the Titanic. Ismay, the sailors asserted, with his 2 daughters and a millionaire, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, and the latter's family, got into the first accident or emergency boats, which are about 28 feet long, and were always ready for lowering onto the bridge. The boat in which Ismay and Sir Cosmo left was manned by 7 seamen. There were 17 persons in the boat. This boat pulled away from the ship a half-hour before any of the lifeboats were put into the water. There were 13 first-class passengers and 5 sailors in the emergency boat. Both boats were away from the ship within 10 or 15 minutes of the ship's crashing into the berg. First boats to get away. Asked to explain how it was possible for 2 boats to be put over the ship's side into the water without being subjected to a rush on the part of the great ship's passengers, the Titanic seaman said, "Ismay and those who left in the 2 emergency boats occupied cabins de luxe. The 2 boats were swinging from davits ready for lowering. We have no idea who notified Mr. Ismay and his friends to make ready to leave the ship, but we do know that the boats in which they were got away first." The sailor's seemingly unvarnished tale then went on as follows. It was perhaps a half-hour before the first of the lifeboats was ready for lowering. Not a man was allowed in one of the lifeboats, so far as we could see, only women and children. The boats were all 36 feet long and carried about 60 passengers. There were about 35 or 40 passengers to a boat when they were lowered, but 2 sailors went in each boat. Besides the 16 lifeboats and the 2 emergency boats, 4 collapsible boats, each with a carrying capacity of 40 passengers, were put over the sides of the Titanic. Every boat on the ship was put into the water. One of the collapsible boats filled with water. The women and children in the boat were mostly third-class passengers. The boat turned keel and nearly 20 persons clung to it. Many of these were rescued by the lifeboats. The spokesman for the sailors here asserted, "We want to make it plain that the officers and crew of the Titanic did their duty. Not a male passenger got into the lifeboats. During the early excitement, men tried to force their way into the boats, but the officers shot them down with revolvers. I saw probably a half-dozen men shot down as the lifeboat to which I was assigned was being filled. The men shot were left to die and sink on the upper deck of the Titanic." The Titanic sailors described how frail women, steeled by a desperate emergency, seized oars and labored with the seamen to get the lifeboats at a safe distance from the great liner, sinking deep and deeper under the weight of water. Women helped with the oars. There were 10 oars to each lifeboat, the sailors said. The women seized the sweeps and helped us to get the boats clear of the ship. We got away about 100 yards from the ship and waited to see what would happen. The liner was sinking fast, but the lights continued to shine through the black night. The end came at 2:30 on Monday morning. The lights on the ship did not go out until 10 minutes before the liner sank. The inrushing seas reaching the after fires produced an explosion, which sundered the big liner. The forward half of the Titanic dived gently down. The after part of the ship stood on end and then disappeared. The force of the explosion blew, it seemed to us watching from the lifeboats, scores of passengers and sailors into the air. That there were stout hearts on the Titanic, even in the last moments of an unprecedented catastrophe, that refused to quail, was proven by the rough seaman's further testimony. The band on the promenade deck, they declared, played Abide With Me and Eternal Father Strong to Save, and other hymns as the ship sank. The Titanic sank at 2:30, almost at the spot where she collided with the mountain of ice. It was an hour later when the Carpathia was sighted by the thinly clad occupants of the lifeboats, and it was 4:30 before the first of the Titanic's passengers set foot on the deck of the Cunarder. It was 8 o'clock on Monday morning, April 15, before the last of the half-clad suffering passengers of the Titanic were taken aboard the Carpathia, a not difficult feat as the sea continued smooth. The Carpathia's run from the Newfoundland banks to New York was uneventful except for the burial at sea of 5 persons. 4 of the 5, according to the sailors, were consigned to the deep at about 4 p.m. on Monday, April 15. 1 of the 4 was a sailor, 1 a fireman, and 2 male passengers of the 3rd class. Telephone call doubted. The alleged negligence of Murdoch, the first officer of the watch, who is blamed as stated above by some of the sailors for the wreck in not responding immediately to a telephone call from the lookout giving warning of the iceberg ahead, is doubted by a naval man who has had a long experience on transatlantic liners. I cannot help doubting, in fact, absolutely disbelieving, that an officer of the watch could be negligent in either responding to a call from the crow's nest or even failing to discover anything in the course of his vessel as soon as the lookout, especially considering the fact that the vessel had been warned of ice several times. The position of the senior officer of the watch is on the windward side of the bridge. He does not depend on the lookout. That man is only a check upon him. Usually any object in the course of the vessel is discovered by both at the same time. The lookout signal was not a telephone call when I was on the seas, but a horn blast. 3 blasts, object dead ahead, 1 blast, object on port bow, 2 blasts, object on starboard bow. That Murdoch did not see the berg as soon as his lookout seems improbable. That he did not see it immediately after his lookout seems impossible. That he did not answer any signal from the lookout immediately is impossible, unless he was dead. Murdoch knew his responsibility, and he wasn't shirking. He wouldn't have been on the watch or on the Titanic if he ever shirked. Could a vessel the size of the Titanic change its course sufficiently to avoid the berg within 3 minutes supposed to have elapsed during which Murdoch didn't answer his lookout's call? It could. I never sailed a vessel the size of the Titanic, but I unhesitatingly say that the Titanic's course could be changed in considerably less than a mile. Why, by putting the wheel hard aport and stopping the engines on that side, the vessel could be turned so quickly that it would list 15 degrees in swinging around. I have steered a transatlantic liner in and out among fishing smacks, and they are easier to hit than an iceberg. Questioned about conditions on moonless night. 2 other seafaring men of long experience, who have many nights sat in the crow's nest of a liner and watched the course, were asked how far an iceberg the size of the one that the Titanic struck could be seen on a clear night without a moon, a condition on which all of the survivors seemed to agree was present the night the Titanic was sunk. One of these men said at least 1 mile, the other at least 2 miles. So the fact remains that Murdoch was supposed to be on the bridge keeping a strict lookout, and not depending on the crow's nest, that he could have seen the iceberg when it was at least a mile from the vessel, and that the Titanic could have been easily turned sufficiently in her course to avoid the berg within a mile. The surviving passengers are unanimous that the unbelievable happened. The voyage had been pleasant and uneventful, except for the fact that it was being made on the largest and most magnificent vessel that ever sailed, and for the keen interest which the passengers took in the daily bulletins of the speed. The Titanic had been making good time, and all accounts agree that on the night of the disaster she was apparently going at her usual rate of from 21 to 25 knots an hour. J. H. Moody, the quartermaster, who was at the helm, said that the ship was making 21, and that the officers were under orders at the time to keep up speed in the hope of making a record passage. These orders were being carried out in face of knowledge that the steamer was in the vicinity of great icebergs sweeping down from the north. That very afternoon, according to the record of the hydrographic officer, the Titanic had relayed to shore a wireless warning from the steamer America that an unusual field of pack ice and bergs menaced navigation off the banks. Officers confident even in the face of danger. But it was a clear and starlit night, as all the survivors described the weather, and the great ship sped through the quiet seas, with officers confident that even though an iceberg should be seen, the vessel could be controlled in ample time, and the passengers rested in full confidence that their temporary quarters in the largest and most magnificent vessel ever constructed were as safe as their own homes. This confidence is emphasized in the tales of nearly all the survivors, that when the crash came there was almost no excitement. Many who felt anxious enough to go on deck to inquire what had happened were little perturbed when they learned that the ship had only struck an iceberg. It appeared to be a glancing blow, and at first there was no indication of a serious accident. A group of men at cards in the smoking room sent one of their number to look out of the window, and when he came back with the announcement that the boat had grazed an iceberg, the party went on with the game. It was never finished. The stoppage of the engines was noticed more than the collision, the effect being, as one survivor put it, like the stopping of a loud ticking clock. The overconfident passengers were not brought to the slightest realization that the collision might mean serious danger until the call ran through the ship, "All passengers on deck with life belts on." Captain Smith, it is said, was not on the bridge when the collision occurred, but when hurriedly summoned by his first officer, he took charge of what seemed a hopeless situation in a manner which the passengers praise as calm, resolute, and efficient to the highest degree. One of the most stirring narratives of action and description of scenes that followed the collision was told by L. Beasley, a Cambridge University man, who was one of the surviving second cabin passengers. The cruise allotted to the boats. The steamer lay just as if she were waiting the order to go on again, when some trifling matter had been adjusted, he said. But in a few minutes we saw the covers lifted from the boats, and the crews allotted to them standing by ready to lower them to the water. Presently we heard the order, "All men stand back, and all ladies retire to the next deck below," the smoking room deck or B deck. The men stood away and remained in absolute silence, leaning against the end railing or pacing slowly up and down. The boats were swung out and lowered from A deck. When they were to the level of B deck, where all the ladies were collected, the ladies got in quietly, with the exception of some who refused to leave their husbands. In some cases they were torn from them and pushed into the boats. All this time there was no trace of any disorder, no panic or rush for the boats, and no scenes of women sobbing hysterically. Everyone seemed to realize so slowly that there was imminent danger. When it was realized that we would be presently in the sea with nothing but our life belts to support us until we were picked up by passing steamers, it was extraordinary how calm everyone was, and how complete the self-control. One by one the boats were filled with women and children. Presently we heard the order, "All men stand back," and all lowered and rowed away into the night. Presently the word went around among the men, "The men are to be put in boats on the starboard side." I was on the port side, and most of the men walked across the deck to see if this was so. Presently I heard the call, "Any more ladies?" Looking over the side of the ship, I saw boat number 13 swinging level with B deck, half full of women. I saw no more come, and one of the crew said then, "You'd better jump." I dropped in and fell in the bottom as they cried, "Lower away." Beasley said that the lifeboat was nearly 2 miles away from the Titanic less than 2 hours later, when they made out that the great liner was sinking. Ship apparently breaks in two. Other survivors who were nearer to the sinking liner told of hearing the strains of "Nearer, My God, to Thee" played as the liner sank, and some of those in the lifeboats blended their voices in the melody. Suddenly there was a mighty roar, and the ship, already half submerged, was seen to buckle and apparently break in two by the force of an explosion caused when the water reached the hot boilers. The bow sank first, and for fully 5 minutes the stern was poised almost vertically in the air, when suddenly it plunged out of sight. With the last hope gone of seeing their loved ones alive, many women in the lifeboats seemed to be indifferent whether they were saved or not. They were nearly 1,000 miles from land, and had no knowledge that a ship of succor was speeding to them. Without provisions or water, there seemed little hope of surviving long in the bitter cold. There were 16 boats in the forlorn procession which entered upon the terrible hours of suspense. The confidence that the big ship, on which they had started across the sea, was sure to bring them safely here, was now turned to utter helplessness. But the shock of learning that their lives were in peril was hardly greater than the relief when, at dawn, a large steamer's stacks were seen on the horizon, and eager eyes soon made out that the vessel was making for the scene. The rescue ship proved to be the Carpathia, which had received the Titanic's distress signals by wireless. By 7 o'clock in the morning, all the Titanic's 16 boats had been picked up, and their chilled and hungry occupants welcomed over the Carpathia's side. The Carpathia's passengers, who were bound for a Mediterranean cruise, showed every consideration for the stricken, and many gave up their cabins, that the shipwrecked might be made comfortable. The rescued were in all conditions of dress and undress, and the women on the Carpathia vied with one another in supplying missing garments. On the 4 days' cruise back to New York, many who had realized that their experiences would be weighted by an anxious world put their narratives to paper, while their nerves were still at a tension from the excitement of the disaster they had barely escaped. The end of Section 4.
Shots and hymn mingle. Titanic settled slowly. Best traditions upheld by passengers and crew. Boiler explosions tore ship apart. Anguish in the boats. Survivors carried to Carpathia. Not enough provision against accident. Outside of great naval battles, no tragedy of the sea ever claimed so many victims as did the loss of the Titanic. The pitiful part of it is that all on board the Titanic might have been saved had there been a sufficient number of lifeboats aboard to accommodate the passengers and crew. Only 16 lifeboats were launched. One of these, a collapsible boat, the last to be launched, was overturned, but was used as a raft and served to save the lives of many men and women. Many women went down with the ship, steerage women unable to get to the upper decks where the boats were launched, maids who were overlooked in the confusion, cabin passengers who refused to desert their husbands, or who reached the decks after the last of the lifeboats was gone and the ship was settling for her final plunge to the bottom of the Atlantic. Confidence in the ability of the Titanic to remain afloat led many of the passengers to death. The theory that the great ship was unsinkable remained with hundreds who had entrusted themselves to the gigantic hulk long after the officers knew that the vessel could not long remain above the surface. That so many of the men passengers and members of the crew were saved, while such a large majority of females drowned, was due to the fact that the women had not appeared about the lifeboats in sufficient numbers to fill them when they first were launched. Dozens of male survivors assert they were forced into the first boats lowered, against their will by officers who insisted that the boat should go overboard, filled to their capacity. From a rather calm, well-ordered sort of leaving of passengers over the side when the disaster was young, the departure of survivors became a riot as the last boats were lowered, and it was apparent that the Titanic would sink. Steerage passengers fought their way to the upper decks and struggled with brutal ferocity against cabin passengers who were aimlessly trying to save themselves. Officers of the ship shot down men who sought to jump into already overcrowded boats. The sound of the pistol shots mingled with the strains of "Nearer, My God, to Thee," played by the ship's orchestra as the Titanic took her final plunge. Murdoch shoots himself. Murdoch, the first officer, who was on the bridge in charge of the Titanic when she struck the iceberg, shot himself when convinced the vessel was doomed. The report that Captain Smith shot himself is contradicted by survivors, who say they saw him swept from the ship as she went down. The Titanic settled into the sea gently. The greater part of her bulk was under water when she slipped beneath the waves. No trace of suction was felt by those in lifeboats only a few hundred yards away. Colonel John Jacob Astor died a hero and went down with the ship. Had he leapt into the water as she made her final plunge, he might have been picked up by one of the lifeboats, but he remained on the deck and was swept under by the drawing power of the great bulk, bound for the bottom. All the officers who died, and most of the members of the crew, upheld the traditions of heroism held sacred by seamen. They did their duty to the end and died with their ship. Not a man in the engine room was saved. Not one of them was seen on deck after the collision. They remained at their posts, far down in the depths of the stricken vessel, until the waves closed over what was at once their pride and their burial casket. A boiler explosion tore the Titanic apart shortly before she sank. This occurred when the seawater, which had been working its way through the forward compartments, invaded the fire room. After the explosion, the Titanic hung on the surface, upheld only by the watertight compartments, which had not been touched by the collision. Although the officers of the Titanic had been warned of the proximity of ice, she was steaming at the rate of 23 knots an hour when she met her end. The lookouts in the crow's nest saw an iceberg ahead and telephoned the bridge. The vessel swung slightly in response to her rudder, and the submerged part of the iceberg tore out her plates along the starboard quarters below the water. Compartment wall gives way. Water rushed into several of the compartments. The ship listed to starboard. Captain Smith hurried to the bridge. It was thought the ship would float, until a shudder that vibrated throughout the great frame told that a compartment wall had given way. Then a definite order was given to man the lifeboats, and stewards were sent to instruct passengers to put on life preservers. So thoroughly grounded was the belief of the cabin passengers that the Titanic was unsinkable that few of them took the accident seriously. Women in evening dress walked out of the magnificent saloons and joked about the situation. Passengers protested against getting into the lifeboats, although the ship was then sinking by the head. Mr. and Mrs. H.J. Allison and their little daughter remained on the ship and were lost, after the infant son of the Allison family had been placed in a lifeboat in charge of a nurse. Isidore Strauss and his wife did not appear on deck until an order had been issued that only women and children should be allowed in the lifeboats. Mrs. Strauss clung to her husband and refused to leave him. They died in each other's arms. Those who escaped in the first lifeboats were disposed to look on their experience as a lark. The sailors manning the oars pulled away from the Titanic. The sound of music floated over the starlit waves. The lights of the Titanic were burning. Like simultaneous photographs of the same tragedy etched on the brains of 745 persons, survivors of the Titanic tell of their experiences and what they saw in those pitifully few hours between the great ship's impact on the iceberg and the appalling moment when she disappeared. As the survivors came, half fainting, half hysterical, down the Carpathia's gangplank, they began to relate these narratives. Many of these were disjointed, fragmentary, a picture here, a frightful flash of recollection there. Some bordered on hallucination. Some were more connected, as one of those who are now beginning to realize the horror through which they came. A few, strangely enough, are calm and lucid, but everyone thrills with some part of the awful truth as its narrator saw it. Individually conflicting stories of the wreck. Each tale is like another view of the same many-sided shield. Sometimes they seem to contradict each other, but that is because those who witness such scenes see them as individuals. There is not a survivor but has something new and startling and dramatic to tell. Taken altogether, their accounts are a composite picture of 700 separate experiences. The shock of the collision had barely jarred the ship. One man who was directing letters in his cabin kept on with his work until he felt a sudden shift in the position of the ship and rushed to the deck in time to leap into a lifeboat. Some of the passengers had returned to their berths. Nothing occurred to indicate to the passengers aboard the Titanic, or moving away from the ship in lifeboats, that the vessel would not remain afloat until help should arrive, until the boilers exploded. Then the end was apparent to all. Men with life preservers strapped about their waists jumped overboard by scores, and some were picked up by boats which had not got far from the ship. As the last 3 lifeboats were launched, the restriction as to women and children was removed. It was a free-for-all then on the deck, where unskilled men, principally stewards, were trying to get the cumbersome boats overboard. Nearly all those who took part in that struggle for life are dead. Those who survived are not anxious to talk about it. Just before the Titanic disappeared from view, men and women leapt from the stern. As the portion of vessel remaining above water swung up to an almost perpendicular position, Hundreds on the upper decks were thrown into the sea and were pulled down in the vortex. The biggest, most thrilling moments of the wreck were those last moments when the airtight compartments in the after part of the Titanic were supporting the balance of the ship. Kept together by green light. None are alive to tell the tale of that short period. Towards 2 o'clock on Monday morning, a green light aboard one of the lifeboats kept the fleet of craft carrying the survivors together. Through the hours until dawn, the men in charge of the boats hovered about that green light. Occasionally bodies of men slipped by the lifeboats. A few men, more dead than alive, were pulled aboard the boats that were now overcrowded. The weather became bitterly cold, and the survivors suffered physical pain as well as mental anguish. Benumbed by the extent of the catastrophe, most of the women sat motionless in their places. The Carpathia appeared soon after dawn. Not until the big Cunarder was close by did the realization of what had happened reach the women survivors. Many of them became temporarily insane. It was necessary to use force to place them in swings in which they were hoisted to the Carpathia's decks. The officers of the Carpathia, knowing the Titanic had gone down, were prepared for an emergency. Passengers on the Cunarder gave their cabins to the Titanic sufferers. The captain surrendered his room for hospital purposes. Stewardesses were compelled to cut the clothing from some of the women who had jumped into the water and been picked up by the lifeboats. Among the survivors picked up by the Carpathia were several babies. These little ones were tossed overboard by their parents and rescued by the boats. The identity of these orphans may never be determined. When the list of persons aboard the Carpathia was checked up, it was found that among the survivors were 30 women who had been widowed by the disaster. Nearly all these women, bereft of their life partners, were reassured by the hope that those who had been left behind had been picked up by another vessel until they reached New York. For some reason, the impression prevailed on the Carpathia that the Californian had picked up a number of survivors floating in the sea, upheld by life preservers. Every husband saved his wife. As against the 30 widows stands the record of every married man who was saved. Each of these men saved his wife also. No wife was left on the Titanic by a husband who had reached a lifeboat. Narratives of the various survivors, assembled in a consecutive narrative, makes one of the most thrilling tales of modern life. It is a narrative filled with heroism unparalleled. Bravery and heroism performed by American businessmen. They were men of millions who had everything to live for, and yet, in that crisis at sea, they worked coolly, steadfastly to save women and children. Then they went down with the White Star liner Titanic, the greatest ship afloat. When the Carpathia came into port carrying the more than 700 survivors of the disaster, the curtain, which had hidden the story of the tragedy since the first word of it was flashed to a startled world, was drawn aside. Here is the real tale of the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic was athrob with the joy of life on Sunday night, when, without warning, the great liner was jammed against a partly submerged iceberg. The blow, which was a glancing one, did not cause much of a jar, and there were some on board who did not know that an accident had happened until later. The liner struck the berg on the starboard side amidships. Only Captain E.J. Smith, the commander, realized that there might be grave danger, and even he did not regard the collision as fatal. Going to the wireless cabin in which Phillips, the operator, was in conversation with Cape Race on traffic matters, he gave orders to the wireless man to hold himself in readiness to flash out a distress signal. At the time, there was a great throng in the main saloon where the ship's orchestra was giving a concert. Despite the bitterly cold weather, some of the passengers were taking advantage of the bright moonlight to stroll upon the decks. Survivors, who were upon the starboard side, said that the ice mountain which the vessel struck was at least 150 feet high where exposed. Under full head of steam. At the time, the ship was steaming ahead under nearly a full head of steam at about 21 knots. If she had been going slowly, the disaster probably would never have happened. Acting under orders from Captain Smith, the ship's officers passed among the passengers, reassuring them as the rumour that the ship had struck spread. "Keep cool, there is no danger," was the message which, repeated over and over, gradually became monotonous. The warning was hardly necessary, for none, save the highest officers of the ship, who were in Captain Smith's confidence, knew the real gravity of the situation. Captain Smith immediately went below and began an examination. This showed that quick action was necessary. Within 15 minutes of his first warning, the captain again entered the wireless cabin and told Phillips to flash the distress signal. "Send the international call for help, so they will understand," Captain Smith said. Bride, the assistant operator, who had been asleep, was standing at Phillips's side. Some of the passengers who had been sleeping were aroused and left their berths. Many hastened on deck to get a glimpse of the berg, but so swiftly was it moving in the Gulf Stream current that, within 20 minutes after the vessel struck it, the ice mountain had disappeared from view. At 11:50 p.m., 15 minutes after the collision, the first intimation of impending danger was given. Officers passed among the passengers, warning them to put on lifebelts. The tarpaulins were cast off the lifeboats and the life rafts, and the davit guys loosened so that the boats could be swiftly swung over the side. Members of the crew also donned life preservers, but, with studied forethought, Captain Smith ordered the principal officers not to don their belts. They were told, however, to be ready to do so in an emergency. Phillips pounds out the SOS. The ship soon had begun to list. The wireless masts were sputtering a blue streak of sparks. Phillips at his key pounded out one SOS call after another. He alternated between the SOS and the CQD, so that there might be no chance of the signal being misunderstood. The first ship to respond to the Titanic was the Frankfurt. The second was the Carpathia. Phillips told the Carpathia's wireless man that the accident was serious and that the White Star liner was sinking by the head. "We are putting about and coming to your aid," was the reply flashed by the Cunarder. About 12:15 o'clock, the officers began warning the women to get into the boats. Even at this time, no one realized that there was any danger. Many of the women refused to get into the boats and had to be placed in them forcibly by the crew. Colonel and Mrs. John Jacob Astor were walking upon the deck. They were approached by Captain H.D. Stephenson of the Swedish Embassy at Washington. Captain Stephenson advised Mrs. Astor to leave the ship. She demurred, saying there was no danger. Finally, Colonel Astor said, "Yes, my dear, it is better for you to go. I will follow in another boat after all the women have been taken off." They kissed and parted. It was a beautiful parting. Mrs. Washington Dodge of San Francisco, wife of another prominent passenger, was asleep in her stateroom. She was aroused by her husband, who urged her to get in a boat. So certain were both that the measures were only precautionary and not necessary, that they did not even kiss each other goodbye. Mr. Dodge embarked in another boat. These incidents are given because they are typical. They show how little the passengers knew that they were standing at the brink of death. The gap increases. The riven plates under the water increased the gap, allowing more and more water to pour into the hold. The steel frame had been buckled by the impact of the collision, and water was rushing into the supposedly watertight compartments around the doors. The dynamo supplying the ship's searchlight and the wireless outfit were put out of commission. Officers hurried hither and thither, reporting to Captain Smith. This master mariner, hero of the White Star Line, knew that he was doomed to death by all the traditions of the sea, but did not flinch. He was the coolest man on board. As lifeboat after lifeboat was filled and swung over the side, it pulled off some distance and stood by. When the officers began to load the women of the steerage into the boats, trouble started. Men refused to be separated from the wives. Families clamoured to get into lifeboats together. The ship's officers had a hard time subduing some of the steerage passengers. The survivors say that some of the men of the steerage were shot by the ship's officers. As the officers were loading the women of the first cabin list into the boat, they came upon Mrs. Isidore Strauss, the elderly wife of the noted philanthropist. She started to get into a boat, but held back, waiting for her husband to follow. Mr. Strauss tenderly took her in his arms, bade her farewell, and explained that he must abide by the inexorable rule of the sea, which says women and children must be saved first. "If you do not go, I don't go," exclaimed the devoted wife. She clung to her husband's arm, and, despite his efforts and the efforts of officers to persuade her to get into one of the boats, she refused. The devoted couple went to death together. While the vessel was going down, the call for help was picked up and acknowledged by the White Star liners Olympic and Baltic. They turned their heads toward the Titanic, but were too far away to render aid. Strains of music drowns all cries. The band, which had been playing incessantly in the main saloon, moved out to the open deck, and the strains of music rose above the shouts of the officers and the cries of the passengers. By 1 o'clock, even those who knew nothing of seamanship began to realize by the angle at which the giant liner careened that she was in grave danger. By this time, more than half of the lifeboats had been sent away, and they formed a ring in the darkness about the great vessel. Excitement began to run high. Major A.W. Butt, USA, military aide to President Taft, William T. Stead, the famous journalist, Colonel Astor, and others of the passengers volunteered their services to Captain Smith. They helped the officers hold back other male passengers who by this time had become thoroughly frightened. As one of the lifeboats was being swung over the ship's side, a frantic mother who had been separated from her 8-year-old boy cried out hysterically. Colonel Astor was standing by the boat, assisting the officers. The little boy, in fright and despair, stretched out his arms appealingly to his mother, but the officer in command of the boat said that it would not be safe for another to enter. Colonel Astor, seeing a girl's hat lying upon the deck, stealthily placed it upon the boy's head. Lifting up the child, he called out, "Surely you will not leave a little girl behind." The ruse worked, and the child was taken on board. Up in the wireless room, Bride had placed a life preserver upon his companion, Phillips, while Phillips sat at his key. Upon returning from Captain Smith's cabin with a message, Bride saw a grimy stoker of gigantic proportions bending over Phillips, removing the lifebelt. Phillips would not abandon his key for an instant to fight off the stoker. Bride is a little man. He was subsequently saved, but plucky. Drawing his revolver, he shot down the intruder, and the wireless work went on as though nothing had happened. J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the International Mercantile Marine Company, owners of the White Star Line, was sitting in the cafe chatting to some friends when the liner ran upon the berg. He was the first one informed by Captain Smith. Ismay rushed to the deck to look at the berg. "The ship cannot sink." "The ship cannot sink," was the reply which he gave, with smiling assurance, to all inquirers. Nevertheless, there are survivors who say that Ismay was one of the passengers of the lifeboats which put off. They saw him enter the boat. By 1:30 o'clock, the great vessel, which only a short time before had been the marvel of the 20th century, was a waterlogged hulk. Panic was steadily growing. The word had been passed around that the ship was doomed. The night continued calm. The sea was smooth. The moon was brilliant in the sky. Into one of the last lifeboats that were launched, 2 Chinamen, employed in the galley, had hidden themselves. They were stretched in the bottom of the boat, face downward, and made no sound. So excited were the women that they did not notice the presence of the Chinese until the boat had pulled off from the Titanic. Then the officer in charge drew his revolver and shot both to death. The bodies were tumbled overboard. The weather was very cold, and the sea was filled with floating ice. All were warned before getting into the boats to dress as warmly as possible. By the time the boats were filled, the water had entered the engine room, and the ship was drifting helplessly. About 2 o'clock, Captain Smith, who had been standing upon the bridge with a megaphone to his mouth, again went to the wireless cabin. "Men," he said to Phillips and Bride, with a break in his voice, "you have done your full duty. You can do no more. Abandon your cabin, for it is now every man for himself." Bride left the cabin, but Phillips still clung to his key. He perished. The saving of Bride, the second wireless man, was only one of a series of thrilling escapes. Wearing a lifebelt, Bride went upon deck. He saw a dozen men passengers tugging at a collapsible boat, trying to work it to the edge of the deck. Bride swept overboard. The wireless man went to their assistance, and they had got it nearly to the point from which they could swing it over when a wave rolled over the deck. Bride, who had hold of an oarlock, was swept overboard with the boat. The next thing he knew, he was struggling in the water beneath the boat. The icy water struck a chill through him. He realized that unless he got from beneath the boat, he would drown. Diving deeply, he came up on the outside of the gunwale and grasped it. On every hand was wreckage of all kinds, and struggling men who had been washed overboard by the submerging coma. Bride clung to the craft until he saw another boat nearby. Exerting all his strength, he swam to this boat and was pulled in it more dead than alive. By this time, all the boats and life rafts had been taken from the ship. The boats were ringed about the ship from 150 feet to 1,000 yards distant. Their occupants could see the lights burning on the vessel, which had settled low in the water. Suddenly, as they looked, great billows of live sparks rose up through the 4 funnels. These were followed by billowing clouds of smoke and steam. The rush of water had reached the boiler rooms, and the boilers had exploded. After this, the great vessel sank more rapidly, and within less than 20 minutes had plunged to her grave, 2 miles beneath the surface. In the meantime, however, those upon the sinking ship, who knew that they had only a few hours at most to live, lived up to the most splendid example of Anglo-Saxon courage. As the ship sank lower, those on board climbed higher, prolonging life to the last minute. Frenzied search was made of every part of the decks by those who hoped that the sailors had overlooked a life raft or small boat which might be used. Their search was in vain. Colonel Astor, Major Butt, C.M. Hayes, W.M. Clark and other friends stood together. Astor and Butt were strong swimmers. When the water reached the ship's rail, Butt and Astor jumped and began swimming rapidly away. There was little suction despite the bulk of the foundering craft. Ship disappears from view. There was a dreadful cry as the ship disappeared from view. Instantly the water was filled with hundreds of struggling men. The spot just above the grave of the liner was strewn with wreckage. Some tried to climb upon the ice cakes, but the cold air and the cold water soon numbed the fingers of the men in the water. Even the most powerful of the refugees soon gave out. Exhausted by their effort and numb from exposure, they dropped one by one. There are survivors, however, among them Dr. Henry J. Frauenthal, of this city, who said that they heard cries from the water for 2 hours after the Titanic sank. Amidst the acres and acres of wreckage, hundreds of dead bodies floated. Many of them were among the first cabin passengers, still dressed in their evening clothes, which they had worn when the ship struck the iceberg. End of section 5.
Managing director accused, Stoker makes direct charge, supported by many survivors, tells about it, please don't knock, demanded food, brave lot of women, first officer shot himself. One man stands out in a most unenviable light amid the narratives of heroism and suffering attending the great Titanic sea tragedy. This man is J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, who, according to accounts of survivors, made himself the exception to the rule of the sea, women first, in the struggle for life. Some of the survivors say he jumped into the first lifeboat, others that he got into the third or fourth. However that may be, he is among the comparatively few men saved, and the manner of his escape aroused the wrath and criticism of many. A woman with a baby was pushed to the side of the third boat, says one survivor. Ismay got out. He then climbed into the fourth boat. I will man this boat, he said, and there was no one who said him nay. Mr. Ismay was the first lifeboat that left the Titanic, declared William Jones, an 18-year-old stoker, who was called to man one of the lifeboats. Jones comes from Southampton, England, and this was his first ocean voyage. He left the Carpathia tottering. There were 3 firemen in each boat, he said. I don't know how many were killed in the boiler explosion, which occurred after the last lifeboat was put off. I saw 4 boats, filled with first cabin passengers, sink. In the boat I was in, 2 women died from exposure. We were picked up about 8 o'clock. Mrs. Lucian P. Smith, of Huntington, West Virginia, daughter of Representative James Hughes, West Virginia, was in the third boat that was launched, and in that boat was Mrs. John Jacob Astor. My niece saw Mr. Ismay leaving the boat. He was attended by several of the crew, and every assistance was given him to get into the boat, says Mrs. Smith. And then the Carpathia finally came along and rescued the shipwrecked passengers. Some of the crew of the Carpathia, together with men of the Titanic, actually carried Mr. Ismay to spacious rooms that had been set aside for him. As soon as Mr. Ismay had been placed in his stateroom, a sign was placed on the door, "Please don't knock." Mrs. W. J. Cardiza's narrative. According to Mrs. W. J. Cardiza of Philadelphia, who gave her narrative after she had arrived at the Ritz-Carlton with T.D.M. Cardiza, J. Bruce Ismay was not only safely seated in a lifeboat before it was filled, but he also selected the crew that rowed the boat. According to Mrs. Cardiza, Mr. Ismay knew that Mr. Cardiza was an expert oarsman, and he beckoned him into the boat. Mr. Cardiza manned an oar until Mr. Ismay's boat was picked up about 2 hours later. The White Star Line, through Ismay, disclaimed responsibility, saying that it was an act of God. Ismay defended his action in taking to the lifeboat. He said that he took the last boat that left the ship. "Were there any women and children left on the Titanic when you entered the boat?" he was asked. The reply was, "I am sure I cannot say." J. Bruce Ismay described to a reporter how the catastrophe occurred. "I was asleep in my cabin," said Mr. Ismay, "when the crash came. It woke me instantly. I experienced a sensation as if the big liner were sliding up on something. We struck a glancing blow, not a head-on, as some persons have supposed. The iceberg, so great was the force of the blow, tore the ship's plates halfway back. I think, although I cannot say definitely, there was absolutely no disorder. I left in the last boat. I did not see the Titanic sink. I cannot remember how far away the lifeboat in which I was had been rowed from the ship when she sank." Mr. Ismay began his interview by reading a prepared statement to this effect. "In the presence and under the shadow of so overwhelmingly a tragedy, I am overcome with feelings too deep for words. The White Star Line will do everything humanly possible to alleviate the sufferings of the survivors and the relatives of those who were lost. The Titanic was the last word in shipbuilding. Every British regulation had been complied with, and her masters, officers, and crew were the most experienced and skillful in the British service." Welcome's exhausted inquiry. "I am informed that a committee of the United States Senate has been appointed to investigate the accident. I heartily welcome a most complete and exhaustive inquiry, as the company has absolutely nothing to conceal, and any aid that my associates or myself, our shipbuilders or navigators can render will be at the service of both the United States and the British governments." "How soon did she sink after she struck?" Mr. Ismay was asked. "Let me see. It was 2 hours and 25 minutes, I think. Yes, that is right." "In other words, there would have been ample time to have taken everybody off if there had been enough lifeboats?" he was asked. "I do not want to talk about that now," was the reply. "Did you go off in the first boat?" someone asked. "What do you mean?" "Were you in the first boat that left the ship?" "No," he replied, slowly and firmly. "I was not. I was in the last boat. It was one of the forward boats." "Did the captain tell you to get in the boat?" "No." "What was the captain doing when you last saw him?" "He was standing on the bridge." "Is it true that he committed suicide?" "No. I heard nothing of it." Mr. Ismay was asked to explain the delay in sending the news of the wreck from the Carpathia. He said, "I can't say anything about that now except that I sent the first telegram announcing what had happened to Mr. Franklin at about 11 o'clock on the morning we were picked up. I am told that telegram did not reach its destination here until yesterday." In response to requests for more details, Mr. Ismay said, "I must refuse to say more until tomorrow, when I appear before the Congressional Committee. For God's sake, get me something to eat. I'm starved. I don't care what it costs or what it is. Bring it to me." An officer's complete account. This was the first statement made by Ismay a few minutes after he was landed on board the Carpathia. It is vouched for by an officer of the Carpathia. The officer gave one of the most complete accounts of what happened aboard the Carpathia from the time she received the Titanic's appeal for assistance until she landed the survivors at the Cunard Line pier. Mr. Ismay reached the Carpathia in about the 10th lifeboat, said the officer. I didn't know who he was, but afterward I heard the others of the crew discussing his desire to get something to eat the minute he put his foot on deck. The steward who waited on him, Maguire, from London, said Mr. Ismay came dashing into the dining room and throwing himself in a chair said, "Hurry, for God's sake, and get me something to eat. I'm starved. I don't care what it costs or what it is. Bring it to me." Maguire brought Mr. Ismay a load of stuff, and when he had finished it, he handed Maguire a $2 bill. "Your money is no good on this ship," Maguire told him. "Take it," insisted Mr. Ismay, shoving the bill in Maguire's hand. "I am well able to afford it. I will see to it that the boys of the Carpathia are well rewarded for this night's work." This promise started Maguire making inquiries as to the identity of the man he had waited on. Then he learned he was Mr. Ismay. I did not see Mr. Ismay after the first few hours. He must have kept to his cabin. The Carpathia received her first appeal from the Titanic about midnight. According to an officer of the Titanic, that vessel struck the iceberg at about 20 minutes to 12 o'clock and went down for keeps at 19 minutes after 2 o'clock. I turned in on Sunday night a few minutes after 12 o'clock. I hadn't closed my eyes before a friend of the chief steward told me that Captain Rostron had ordered the chief steward to get out 3,000 blankets and to make preparations to care for that many extra persons. I jumped into my clothes and was informed of the Titanic. By that time, the Carpathia was going at full speed in the direction of the Titanic. The crew told what is expected of them. The entire crew of the Carpathia was assembled on deck and were told of what had happened. The chief steward, Harry Hughes, told them what was expected of them. "Every man to his post, and let him do his full duty like a true Englishman," he said. "If the situation calls for it, let us add another glorious page to British history." After that, every man saluted and went to his post. There was no confusion. Everything was in readiness for the reception of the survivors before 2 o'clock. Only one or two of the passengers were on deck, one of them, Mr. Beechler, having been awakened by a friend, and the other because of an inability to sleep. Many of the Carpathia's passengers slept all through the morning up to 10 o'clock and had no idea what was going on. We reached the scene of the collision about 4 o'clock. All was black and still, but the mountain of ice just ahead of us told a story. A flare from one of the lifeboats some distance away was the first sign of life. We answered with a rocket, and then there was nothing to do but wait for daylight. The first lifeboat reached the Carpathia about 5:30 o'clock in the morning, and the last of the 16 boats was unloaded before 9 o'clock. Some of the lifeboats were only half filled, the first one having but 2 men and 11 women, when it had accommodations for at least 40. There were few men in the boats. The women were the gamest lot I have ever seen. Some of the men and women were in evening clothes, and others among those saved had nothing on but night clothes and raincoats. Imagine their husbands picked up by other vessels. As soon as they were landed on the Carpathia, many of the women became hysterical, but on the whole they behaved splendid. Men and women appeared to be stunned all day Monday, the full force of the disaster not reaching them until Tuesday night. After being wrapped up in blankets and given brandy and hot coffee, their first thoughts were of their husbands and those at home. Most of them imagined that their husbands had been picked up by other vessels and then began flooding the wireless rooms with messages. We knew that those who were not on board of the Carpathia had gone down to death, and this belief was confirmed Monday afternoon when we received a wire from Mr. Marconi himself asking why no news had been sent. We knew that if any other vessel could by any chance have picked them up, it would have communicated with land. After a while, when the survivors failed to get any answer to their queries, they grew so restless that Captain Rostron posted a notice that all private messages had been sent and that the wireless had not been used to give information to the press, as had been charged. Little by little it began to dawn on the women on board, and most of them guessed the worst before they reached here. I saw Mrs. John Jacob Astor when she was taken from the lifeboat. She was calm and collected. She kept to her stateroom all the time, leaving it only to attend a meeting of the survivors on Tuesday afternoon. J.R. Moody was a quartermaster on the bridge beside First Officer Murdoch when the Titanic struck the berg. There is no way of telling the approach of the berg, and besides, I do not intend to go into that now, said Moody. We struck, and we paid dearly for it, and that is all there is to that now. We were running between 22 and 23 knots an hour. It seemed incredible that much damage had been done at first. We struck so lightly. There was a little jar. Almost immediately, though, Captain Smith rushed to the bridge and took charge. Afterward, I saw Murdoch standing on the first deck. I saw him raise his arm and shoot himself. He dropped where he stood. As far as Mr. Bruce Ishmay goes, he was in the second boat that left the Titanic. The first boat swamped, I am sure of that, and Mr. Ishmay was bundled into the second boat, regardless of his protests, to take charge of it in place of First Officer Murdoch, who had shot himself. When the Titanic started to sink, Captain Smith was on the bridge. I saw him. The first lurch brought the bridge almost under water, and the captain was washed off. He clambered back and must have been there another 10 minutes, when the bridge sank slowly down, and he was washed off for the second time. A boat tried to make back to him, but he waved for it to keep back. The last anybody saw of him, he was fighting his way back to the Titanic. He drowned fighting to reach her. J. Bruce Ismay never showed himself once during the whole voyage and on the voyage on the Carpathia. We never saw him from the time the vessel took up the survivors until we reached the dock. Personally, I do not think that Captain Smith was responsible for the high rate of speed at which the Titanic was traveling when the ship foundered. I kept a record during the voyage. From noon of Saturday to noon of Sunday, the Titanic traveled 546 knots. I believe they were trying to break records. When the crash came, the boat was traveling at top speed. Henry E. Stingle's story. This was the statement which Henry E. Stingle gave early today at his residence, 1075 Broad Street, Newark, New Jersey. Shaken with the horrors of the wreck and the nerve-wracking voyage on the rescue ship Carpathia, Mr. Stingle spoke in stern terms of the recklessness which made the accident so appalling. Although it was near to midnight when he and his wife reached Newark, there were 100 friends waiting to receive them, all of whom hung breathlessly on the recital of the perils which the two escaped. Mr. Stingle and his wife had one of the most remarkable reunions of any persons on the ship. The two did not escape in the same boat, Mrs. Stingle being in the first launched, while her husband was in the very last boat from the starboard side. Mrs. Stingle looked many years older than when she left the other side a few weeks ago, and was even more emphatic than her husband in criticism of the shortcomings of the White Star officials. There was absolutely no water in our boat. We would have died of thirst if rescue had not been near at hand, she said. I understand it was the way in all the other lifeboats, few of which even had lanterns. I have heard that a couple of them were provided with bread at the last moment, but our boat was absolutely without any food. Mrs. Stingle was warned by the constant strain which had been pressed upon her in the last 5 days. This has been such a terrible worry that I feel as though I could never sleep again, she said. Oh, it was horrible, horrible. Sometimes I think I would have been better dead than to have so much to remember. You see, when the crash first came, no one realized the awful seriousness of the situation. It was a loud, grinding crash, and it shook the boat like a leaf. But we all had become so filled with the idea that the Titanic was a creation greater than the seas that no one was terror-stricken. Some of the women screamed and children cried, but they told us it was all right and that nothing serious could happen. Did not want to leave her husband. I was just preparing for sleep when the crash came, and throwing on some clothes, I rushed on deck with my husband. In a short time we were told that the women would be sent in the boats. I did not want to leave my husband, but he laughed and told me that the boating was only temporary. There was very little confusion when we put off, and the men in the first and second cabins were absolutely calm. Mr. Stingle kissed me and told me not to worry, that he would come in a later boat unless it was decided to bring us back on the ship. For some reason, no attention was paid to the men who were put in our boat. One of them was an undersized Chinaman, and the other was an Oriental of some kind. When the lifeboat struck the water, they crawled up in the bottom and began to moan and cry. They refused to take their places at the oars, and first-class women passengers had to man many of the rowlocks. Still, none of us thought that the great Titanic would sink. We rowed 200 yards away, as they had told us, watching the great ship. Then the lights began to go out, and then came a terrible crash, like dynamite. I heard a woman in the bow scream, and then came 3 more terrific explosions. The boat gave a sudden lurch, and then we saw the men jumping from the decks. Some of us prayed, and I heard women curse, but the most terrible thing was the conduct of the Chinaman and the Oriental. They threw themselves about the boat in absolute fits and almost upset the boat. They were a menace during the whole night, and in the morning, when the light began to come in the east, and when the women were exhausted from trying to man the oars, the 2 of them found some cigarettes and lay in the bottom of the boat and smoked while we tried to work the oars. There is no survivor better qualified to tell of the last incidents aboard the vessel than Mr. Stingle is. He was one of the last 3 men to leave the boat. He is a man of scientific turn of mind and is in possession of some valuable data concerning the wreck. Little disorder on board. As my wife has told you, there was but little disorder on board after the crash, he said. I realized the seriousness of the situation immediately because I saw Captain Smith come out of the cabin. He was closely followed by Mr. and Mrs. George Widener of Philadelphia. "What is the outlook?" I heard Mr. Widener inquire. "It is extremely serious, gentlemen," he said. "Please keep cool and do what you can to help us." Deck stewards rushed through the corridors, rapping frantically on the doors of the occupied cabins. All were told that the danger was imminent. Some heeded, and grasping the first clothing they could find, they rushed on deck. Others refused to come out. They would not believe there was danger. On deck, the boat crews were all at their posts. The big lifeboats had been shoved around, ready to be put over the side. Women and children were picked up bodily and thrown into them. The rule of the sea, women and children first, was being enforced. One after the other, the boats went over the side. Then a cry was set up. "There are no more boats," was the shout. Consternation seized upon all that remained. They had believed there would be room for all. Uncontrollable terror seized many. They fought for the life belts. Some frantically tried to tear loose deck fittings, hoping to make small rafts that would sustain them until help would come. But everything was bolted fast. Then, fearful they would be dragged to death in the swirling suction that would follow, the men began to leap into the ice-filled ocean. They jumped in groups, seemingly to an agreed signal, according to the stories of the survivors tonight. Some who jumped were saved, coming up near lifeboats and being dragged into them by the occupants. Slowly, steadily, and majestically, the liner sank. One deck after the other was submerged. Whether the boilers exploded is a question. Robert W. Daniel, a Philadelphia banker, says that when the icy water poured into the boiler room, 2 separate explosions followed that tore the interior out of the liner. Others say they did not hear any explosions. Pistol shots fired. Pistol shots were fired. Some survivors say they were fired at men who tried to force women and children out of the way. No one who claimed to be an eyewitness to the shooting could be located. One account related in circumstantial detail that the captain and his first officer shot themselves, but Daniel and other passengers positively say they saw the white-bearded, grizzled face of the veteran mariner over the top of the bridge just before the railing disappeared. They say not until then did he jump into the ocean to drown in the suction that marked the last plunge of the Titanic. The plight of the survivors in the boats was pitiful in the extreme. Few of the women or children had sufficient clothing, and they shivered in the bitter cold blast that came from the great field of ice which surrounded them. The bergs and cakes of drift ice crashed and thundered, bringing stark terror to the helpless victims. Frail women aided with the heavy oars, tearing their tender hands until the blood came. Few of the boats were fully manned. Sailors had stood aside deliberately, refusing life that the women might have a chance for safety, although their places were in the boats. Daybreak found the little flotilla bobbing and tossing on the surface of the ocean. It was not known whether help was coming. Panic seized some of the occupants. Some of the women tried to jump into the water and had to be forcibly restrained. The babies, little tots, just old enough to realize their position, found themselves heroes. They set an example which moved their elders to tears as they told of it tonight. Some tried to comfort their stricken parents. Finally, off in the distant horizon, a sailor in the leading boat discerned smoke. "We are saved," went up the cry, and the rescue came just in time, for before the Carpathia had taken aboard the occupants of the last frail craft, the waves were increasing in height, kicked up by the wind, and had increased with the rising of the sun. All were tenderly cared for on the Cunard liner, the regular passengers willingly giving up their cabins to their unfortunate refugees. Medical aid was forthcoming, and nothing left undone that could relieve the distress. Did not see any shots fired. It was his face, more than anything else, which made me fearful, continued Mr. Stingle. He looked like an old, old man. I heard him give instructions to his officers, and they took their stations at the boats. I did not see anyone shot during the whole wreck. They fired 3 shots in the air to show the steerage men that the guns were loaded, but I was on the boat almost to the last, and I didn't see anyone shot. The boat which saved me was not a regular lifeboat, but a light emergency boat. There was a great rush for it. By the time it was launched, the first fear had subsided. It was the last to be lowered from the starboard side. The Titanic seemed to be floating safely, and a lot of people preferred it to the flimsy-looking rowboats. A deckhand told me that there was a vacant place in it. There I found Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon, Lady Duff-Gordon, and her maid, Miss Francitelli. Just as the boat was lowered, Mr. A.L. Solomon jumped in. We had gone but a little way from the ship when the first boiler explosion came. It was followed in quick succession by 3 others, at intervals of about 1 second apart. In the boat which harbored Mr. Stingle were 3 stokers and 2 members of the steerage. Mr. Stingle told graphically of the last plunges of the ship and its final sinking. He declared that there was little eddy and no whirlpool when it sank. Many of the men on the Titanic jumped into the sea before the decks were awash. In telling of the long night on the sea, Mr. Stingle gave great credit to a member of the crew who had taken 3 green lanterns on board just as the small lifeboat was manned. He said it was the only beacon which the other lifeboats had for guidance, and said without it many more would surely have been lost. Mrs. Stingle spoke particularly of the calmness of the night. When the sun rose, there was not a ripple on the water, she said. It was as calm as a little lake in Connecticut. Words could not express the wonderful, terrible beauty of it all, but of course I couldn't appreciate it, because I thought my husband had gone down in the sea. The shout of land ever uttered by an explorer was not half so joyful as the shout of "ship," which went up when the Carpathia appeared on the horizon that morning, she said. The first dim lights which appeared were eagerly watched, and when it was really identified as a ship, men and women broke down and wept. The reunion of Mr. and Mrs. Stingle was on the Carpathia. Each was mourning the other as lost for more than an hour after it had been on the vessel when they met on the promenade deck. Their separation and subsequent reunion was generally considered one of the most remarkable in the history of the wreck. End of section 6.
J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, who has been widely charged with cowardice in saving himself when the Titanic was wrecked, has found his first offender in the person of August H. Weichman, Commodore Barber of that company's fleet, who was chief ship's barber on the ill-fated vessel. Weichman declares that he was a witness of the scene when Ismay left the vessel, and that he was literally thrown into the lifeboat by a seaman who did not recognize him and thought he was interfering with the work. He asserts that Ismay was striving valiantly to help in the work of launching the boats, and went overboard only under physical compulsion. Weichman was accompanied to his home in Palmyra, New Jersey, by his brothers-in-law, A.H. and John Henricks, who tell of a vexatious experience in getting him off the Carpathia. Weichman was badly injured when he was blown off the ship by the explosion of the boilers. A.H. Hendricks charges that the custom officials refused him a pass to the pier because he wanted to get a member of the ship's crew, and the officials said they were not bothering about the crew. The brothers finally made their way to the pier by running between double lines of automobiles. Weichman was brought off the Carpathia on a rolling chair, too late to catch the special train which came to this city, and the Pennsylvania Railroad officials provided him with a berth free of charge. "I was in my barber shop reading," said Weichman, "when I felt a slight jar, and realized we had struck something. I went to the gymnasium to see whether others had noticed it. I found some of the men punching the bag, while Colonel Astor, Mr. Widener, and a number of others were watching them. I had known Mr. Widener for some time, and I advised him to put on a life belt. He laughed at me. 'What sense is there in that? This boat isn't going to sink,' he said to me. 'There is plenty of time. We're safer here than in a small boat, anyway.' Then came the order to man the boats, and I went on deck to help. I saw Mr. Ismay at the rail, directing and helping the men. One of them did not recognize him and said, 'What are you interfering for? You get back out of the way.' Another seaman warned the first man that he was speaking to the head of the line. 'I don't care who he is. He's got to get back or go overboard. We can't be bothered with him and his orders now,' was the reply. Mr. Ismay stuck to his place and continued giving orders and directing the men. The rule was observed of sending over 4 women and then a man to look after them. When 4 women had been put over, the seaman turned to Mr. Ismay and ordered him over the side. Mr. Ismay refused to go, when the seaman seized him, rushed him to the rail, and hurled him over. I saw that myself, and I know that Mr. Ismay did not go of his own accord, and that the charge of cowardice is unfair and untrue. While I was still helping at the boats, there came an explosion from below decks, and the ship took an awful lunge, throwing everybody into a heap. I was hurled clear of the vessel's side, and landed on top of a bundle of deck chairs which was floating on the water. I was badly bruised, and my back was sprained. My watch stopped at 1:50 a.m., and I believe it was at that time I was thrown into the water. While I lay floating on the bundle of chairs, there came another terrific explosion, and the ship seemed to split in two. There was a rain of wreckage, and a big piece of timber fell on me, striking my life belt. I believe if it had not been for the belt, I would have been killed. I floated for what I believe was about 2 hours. Then arms reached down and drew me aboard a life raft. The man who did this was a seaman named Brown, whose life I probably had saved 2 years ago by hurrying him to a hospital in England when he was taken ill suddenly. There were 6 persons on the raft, and others were in the water up to their necks, hanging on to the edges of the raft. The raft was already awash, and we could not take them aboard. One by one, as they became chilled through, they bade us good-bye and sank. In the bottom of the raft was a man whom I had shaved that morning, and whom I had been told was worth $5 million. I did not know his name. He was dead. And so we floated on the raft, bereft of hope and stupefied by the calamity, until picked up by the Carpathia. I was so badly injured, they had to take me on board in a boatswain's chair. The happiness of husbands at seeing their wives put in the way of safety from the Titanic was described by Mrs. Terrell Cavendish, daughter of Henry Segal. She said, "I was with my husband in our stateroom when the accident happened. He awakened me. I remember it was midnight and told me something was the matter with the boat. My husband kissed me and put me into a boat in which were 23 women. He told me to go and that he would stay on the ship with the other men. They were happy to see their wives lowered away in the boats. They kept telling us they would be all right because the ship could not sink. We were lowered into the water without any light. Only one man tried to get into the boat. He was pushed back by a sailor. Most of the women in the boat I was in were in their bare feet. I can still see those husbands kissing their wives and telling them goodbye. I can see the sailors standing by so calm and brave. The sight of those good men who gave their lives for others will always be with me. Words can't tell the tale of their sacrifice." The hours we spent in that small boat after those heroic men went down were hours of torture. When we got on the Carpathia, we were treated with the utmost consideration. I saw Mr. Ismay when he came on board. He was trembling from head to foot and kept saying, "I'm Ismay, I'm Ismay." Immediately upon their disembarkation from the Carpathia, Mr. and Mrs. William E. Carter, Miss Lucille Carter, and William E. Carter, Jr., of Newport, Bryn Mawr, and 2116 Walnut Street, Philadelphia, about whom so much anxiety was felt for the first 24 hours after the news of the Titanic disaster reached the mainland, went in taxicabs to the home of William Dickerman at 89 Madison Avenue. Mr. Dickerman is a brother-in-law of Mr. Carter. I kissed my husband good-bye, and as he stood on the deck, I went down the side to a lifeboat. There were no seamen there. It was life or death. I took an oar and started to row, said Mrs. Carter, who was formerly Miss Lucille Polk, of Baltimore, when seen later at the Madison Avenue house. Mrs. Carter had just come from the ship, and the tears were still in her eyes. Glad tears from the welcome she had received from her relatives, among whom was Anderson Polk, who had come to New York to meet her. She told of being roused from her sleep at 14 minutes of 12 on Sunday night by the sudden crash, of rushing out on the deck to find the chaos of destruction quickly form itself into the decisive action of brave men about to face their death. Clasping her hands tightly, she told how the men had stood back or else helped to lower away the lifeboats, and then, kissing their wives, bade them a good-bye which they thought would be forever. In brief words, tensely spoken, she told of going into the lifeboat and taking an oar. At 10 minutes past 1 o'clock there was a sudden explosion, and the giant hulk of the Titanic blew up, rearing in the water like a spurred horse, and then sinking beneath the waves. She had to pull hard with her oars in the desperate attempt, which the poorly manned lifeboat had to make, to keep from being sucked down with the diving Titanic. After minutes of work with the desperation of death, they made their way out of the suction and were saved. It was not until she was taken aboard the Carpathia that she met her husband, saved because he had to man an oar in another lifeboat. "We had a pleasant voyage from England," began Mrs. Carter. "The ship behaved splendidly, and we did not anticipate any trouble at all. I had retired on Sunday night, an hour before we struck the iceberg. The men were in the cabin smoking. Most of them were in the smoking room when the ship hit. The first I knew of the accident was a tremendous thump which nearly threw me out of my berth. I realized that something must have happened, and feared that it was a bad accident. A moment later my husband came down to the stateroom and told me that we had struck an iceberg. There was no confusion. I dressed myself hurriedly and went on deck with my children. The ship was badly damaged. The officers thought, at first, that she would not sink, and we were told to be calm. But it was not long before we knew that the ship could not long stand the strain of the water, which was pouring into the bow and bearing the ship down on her forward part. Then came the time when we knew that it must either be the lifeboats or stay on the ship and sink with her. The seamen began to lower away the lifeboats. One after another they released whatever machinery held them, and they dropped into the ocean. There was ice all about us, and the night, being comparatively clear, we could see the floes around us when we peered down over the side of the ship. When the boats had been lowered, then it was that the time of parting came. There was no excitement. Every one of the men whose wives or womenfolks were with them took them to the side of the ship where a lifeboat was waiting, and kissed them over the side. Major Archibald Butt remained on board and went down with the ship. Colonel Astor also went down with the ship. Mrs. Astor was in my boat. The colonel took her to the side and kissed her and saw her over the side. When I went over the side with my children and got in the boat, there were no seamen in it. Then came a few men, but there were oars with no one to use them. The boat had been filled with passengers, and there was nothing else for me to do but to take an oar. We could see now that the time of the ship had come. She was sinking, and we were warned by the cries from the men above to pull away from the ship quickly. Mrs. Thayer, wife of the vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, was in my boat, and she too took an oar. It was cold, and we had no time to clothe ourselves with warm overcoats. The rowing warmed me. We started to pull away from the ship. We could see the dim outlines of the decks above, but we could not recognize anybody. We had pulled our lifeboat away from the Titanic for a distance of about a city block. That is about all, I should say, when the Titanic seemed to shake to pieces. The ship had struck about 14 minutes to 12. It was 10 minutes past 1 when we saw her lunge. She had exploded. There was a rumbling noise within her, then she gave a lurch and started to go down. We realized what it meant, that the sinking ship would suck us under with her. It was a moment later that the suction struck us. It was all we could do to keep from being caught. So strong was the drag down that followed the Titanic. But we pulled away at last, after straining as hard as we could at the oars. Then we were alone in the boat, and it seemed darker. We remained in the boat all night, waiting for daylight to come. It came at last, and when it broke over the sea, we saw ice floes all about it. It was about 8:30 o'clock when the Carpathia came into sight. I can't tell you how I felt when I saw her. I had believed that my husband had gone down on the ship. It was not until after we were taken over the side of the Carpathia that I saw him. Mr. Carter had been compelled to take an oar in a lifeboat that was not sufficiently manned. That is how he came to be saved. All of the men waited for the women to go first. Mr. Carter was among the number. When he put me into a lifeboat, he stayed back, and I had thought, when I saw the ship blow up and sink, that he had gone down with her. Mr. Ismay does not deserve any criticism for being saved. He was another of those who had to man an oar in a lifeboat, so as to get the boats out of danger by being sucked under by the sinking Titanic. 3 French survivors, Ferdinand Aumont, Pierre Maréchal, son of the well-known French admiral, and Paul Chèvre, the sculptor, conjointly cabled to the Matin a graphic narrative of the disaster to the Titanic, in which they repeatedly insist that more lives could have been saved if the passengers had not had such dogged faith that the Titanic was unsinkable. Several boats, they declared, could have carried double the number. The 3 Frenchmen say that they were playing bridge with a Philadelphian when a great, crunching mass of ice packed up against the portholes. As they rushed on deck, there was much confusion, but this quickly died down. One of the officers, when questioned by a woman passenger, humorously replied, "Do not be afraid, we are merely cutting a whale in two." Presently, the captain appeared to become somewhat nervous and ordered all to put on life preservers. The boats were then lowered, but only a few people stirred, and several of the boats put off half empty, one with only 15 persons in it. When the Frenchman's boat rowed off for half a mile, the Titanic presented a fairy-like picture, illuminated from stem to stern. Then, suddenly, the lights began to go out, and the stern reared up high in the air. An immense clamor rose on all sides, and during an hour anguished cries rang out. It was, said the narrators, like a great chorus chanting a refrain of death with wild obstinacy. Sometimes the cries died out, and then the tragic chorus began again, more terribly and more despairingly. The narrative continues. Those shrieks pursued us and haunted us as we pulled away in the night. Then one by one the cries ceased, and only the noise of the sea remained. The Titanic was engulfed almost without a murmur. Her stern quivered in a final spasm, and then disappeared. The Frenchmen and their companions suffered bitterly from the cold. They cried out to attract attention, and a German baron who was with them emptied his revolver in the air. When finally the Carpathia appeared, a feeble hurrah went up from the small boats, every one of which moved as swiftly as possible toward the liner. The Frenchmen related tragic incidents as they were leaving the sides of the Titanic. After all the boats had been launched, many of the passengers who had stayed behind too long tried to embark on a collapsible raft, which worked badly. 50 persons climbed onto the raft, which was half filled with water. One after another, the passengers on the raft were drowned, or perished with the cold. When a body was found in the way, it was thrown overboard, and only 15 of the 50 who had taken refuge on the raft were saved by the Carpathia. End of Chapter 7, read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, August 7, 2024.